Written in blood 1. Black Nail was just hanging around. Also, since he had nothing better to do, he was re-examining some of the choices he had made recently. He wasn't quite sure why things had gone the way they had, but it didn't help that he was very new at all this. He was new at re-examining things, that is. Although, this was also the first time he had been hung from a tree by his ankle. The hobgoblin jerked around again as he tried to pull himself up and reach the rope noose around his ankle so he could cut it with his claws. Unfortunately, he couldn't muster the strength, and all his efforts did was send him swaying back and forth through the air. He also started to get more than a little nauseous. With a hiss of frustration, Black Nail gave up and decided to wait for Cedar to come back out of his tent. The upside-down forest spun and swayed around him as he waited. He should have known better than to try and go against his master. Black Nail had thought for sure that he had come up with a good way to show Cedar that he couldn't just boss him around. Apparently, he had been wrong. It had all started several days ago. Black Nail had awoken to find himself in a strange lean-to out in the middle of the woods. This had confused him because he was fairly sure he had gone to sleep in a completely different place. Where were all the human bandits? Still sleepy but somewhat alarmed, he had gotten up and looked around. To his relief, he had spotted the familiar outline of Cedar's tent off to one side, and another tent alongside it. Black Nail had quickly come to the conclusion that the fact that his master's tent was nearby meant that he hadn't been abandoned. It must have been Cedar that had brought him here while he slept. Curious as to why he had been moved, he decided to find his master and ask. So he had tried walking over to the tents, only to immediately trip over his own feet, and find out what the nearby dirt tasted like. Blat. It was then he had looked down and discovered that his body had changed. At first he had thought that he had simply lost a lot of weight and gotten skinnier, but he soon realized that all his limbs were actually longer. That had confused him quite a bit. Then he had heard a snigger of laughter and looked over to see one of the scouts from the camp grinning at him from a few feet away. He had growled at the man in annoyance. Who was he to laugh at Black Nail? Hey Cedar, your hobgoblin's finally awake and he's grumpy as a hungry bear, the man named Varhus had yelled as he had measured Black Nail with his gaze. He hadn't seemed impressed. His master had then arrived and immediately ordered Black Nail to do all his usual chores. For some reason this had made Black Nail angry and resentful, but he had stifled his emotions and done as he was told. He was rewarded with a large slab of meat that he had hungrily scoffed down before getting back to work. Cedar should have given him more though. Why I bigger, he had asked Cedar as he gutted and skinned a rabbit. His new longer and more dexterous fingers had made the work easier and faster. You've turned into a hobgoblin. It happens to some goblins. They get taller and meaner, his master had explained in his usual gruff voice. Black Nail had remembered his master mentioning hobgoblins before in the past, so he had grudgingly accepted that explanation. He still suspected Cedar was withholding information from him though. His head had felt weirdly light, and part of it had been whispering that he couldn't trust his master. Black Nail's thoughts had strayed while he worked. Why should everyone keep telling him what to do? He had gotten smarter and larger, so why shouldn't he be in charge? Cedar had then reached over to hand the hobgoblin a rabbit hide, but Black Nail had felt a stab of unease at the man's closeness and pulled away. Cedar had frowned at the hobgoblin's reaction and scrutinized him for a second before tossing him the pelt and turning away. Black Nail had taken this as more evidence that his master was lying to him or tricking him somehow. Cedar had kept Black Nail busy all that day doing chores, but he had quickly figured out that they were mostly make work. This really annoyed the hobgoblin. Why was his master doing this to him? Didn't he deserve better? Why should Cedar boss him around anyway? He had started to let a bit of hostility slip into his gaze as his eyes followed Cedar around. Cedar had noticed and met the gaze but hadn't said anything, instead he had simply beaten Black Nail repetitively with a stick. Of course, Cedar had claimed it was some sort of training, but Black Nail hadn't really believed him. After the chores were done to Cedar's satisfaction, he had thrown Black Nail a wooden sword, and begun to teach him swordsmanship. This is how every hot-blooded youngster learns respect and discipline. It worked on me, so it should work on you. Now I know you don't like hitting people, but from now on you are going to have to, he had told Black Nail. He had then shown the hobgoblin how to hold the mock weapon, while the other man Varhus had silently watched them. Black Nail had noticed that Varhus had a real sword at his side, not a mock blade. It had struck him as very suspicious, but he was soon distracted from his musings. The next part of sword training had involved Cedar yelling at Black Nail about how he was doing everything wrong, and the hobgoblin being smacked with the wooden blade over and over again. This had infuriated Black Nail, and really hurt. Uncontrollable rage had poured out from some new depth within him, and Black Nail had hissed and snarled as he tried to block the blows. His mouth had watered at the thought of biting into Cedar's flesh, but even with a sword of his own he couldn't defend himself against Cedar's skillful attacks and longer reach. At first he had simply tried to defend, but Cedar had yelled and hit him over and over again until Black Nail had grown so angry he had lost all control. He had forgotten his usual rule against harming humans and swung out at Cedar's head. Cedar had given him permission anyway. When Cedar had easily dodged that blow, Black Nail had launched himself at Cedar, dropped his wooden practice sword, and reached out to tear the man apart with his bare claws. That had been a very bad idea. As Black Nail sprung towards him, Cedar had slipped to the side, and brought his blunt blade down in a two-handed swing against Black Nail's head. The resulting blow had hurt a lot, stunned the hobgoblin, and given him his second taste of dirt that day. It hadn't tasted very good. Then Cedar had yelled at Black Nail until he got to his feet and continued. He hadn't even been angry about being attacked, but he was angry about how bad the attack had been. Eventually a very tired and sore Black Nail had simply collapsed from exhaustion, after what seemed like hours of futile attack attempts. Only then had Cedar called it a day. Cedar had thrown the prone hobgoblin his dinner and instructed him to go to bed, and Black Nail had. He had been too tired to even think of arguing. The next few days had been more of the same, chores in the morning and beatings at night. Black Nail had begun to grow frustrated and a hatred of Cedar had developed deep within him. His head had felt so strange and weird. Strange new thoughts kept popping up. He had been sure everything would feel better when he was in charge though. As soon as they started sparring again, Black Nail had tried to hit his master, but could never quite manage it. So he had grown even more spiteful and hostile. He'd begun to growl and hiss every time he saw Cedar, or the other man Varus. They were both obviously out to get him, and prevent him from taking his rightful place as the alpha. They weren't even hobgoblins. Then that morning he had awoken early, and in fit of anger he had snuck up on the tent where his master was sleeping. He hadn't known what he was going to do when he got there, only that it would involve sweet revenge. Maybe he would have stolen some things, or broken Cedar's stuff. He never had a chance to find out. It had been a trap. As he had crept silently along the path to Cedar's tent from his sleeping place, something had snagged the hobgoblin's foot and violently flung him into the air. After a surprised shriek, he had quickly realized that he had stepped in something like a giant rabbit trap that had been hidden under some leaves. He had flushed in embarrassment at the thought of being as stupid as a rabbit. The noise caused by a startled hobgoblin being pulled into the air by a small unfurling tree had caused Cedar to come out to investigate. He had walked out of his tent, seen Black Nail, grunted, and then gone back inside to sleep. Black Nail had been too ashamed to say anything, so he had just hung there quietly for a few hours. At least it had given him a lot of time to think. His anger had long since faded away. Maybe it was just because hanging upside down made his head feel weird in a completely different way, but looking back he really didn't understand what he had been thinking. Over the past few days he had not been acting like himself at all. Even now some part of Black Nail wanted to wrap his hands around Cedar's neck and choke him for tricking him like this. He would never have thought of doing that before. Was he so angry all the time because he was a hobgoblin now? Could he somehow go back to how he had been before? Wait a second, why was he asking himself all these weird questions? He had never done that before. In fact he was still doing it, he was thinking about everything, even other things he was thinking about. What if he couldn't stop? That would be horrible. Alright, stop thinking right now. Was it working? Luckily for Black Nail his train of thought was interrupted as Cedar emerged from his tent again. He then looked up at the hobgoblin expectantly. Sorry master, Black Nail said as he grinned nervously. He thought his master looked skeptical of his apology. For what? Cedar asked. Black Nail thought about it for a minute as he hung there. Being angry, trying to hit master, and being sneaky. I've been very bad, Black Nail answered with regret. You're supposed to hit me during sword practice, but only during sword practice. As for being angry, can you tell me why you were acting like that? Cedar asked him. I angry because I grow? You say so earlier, he replied uncertainly. And how do I know you will stop? Cedar asked. Black Nail took another few minutes to consider the question. It was kind of a tricky question, but at least all the thinking his mind kept doing lately was proving useful. Because you teach me how. Black Nail replied tentatively. His response caused a big grin to spread across Cedar's face. That's right. So let's get back to sword practice. There is nothing like it for teaching the undisciplined control, Cedar explained as he moved over to cut the hobgoblin down. Black Nail groaned. Hanging upside down from a tree hadn't been all that bad, maybe he should have kept his mouth shut. Now that he was thinking somewhat straight, the first thing the new hobgoblin did when he got down was to look himself over in a nearby bucket of water. Two short black horns rose from his bald head. His previous short and somewhat pudgy body had been stretched out until he was almost as tall as a human. He was skinnier than any human though, but his wiry green body was still muscled. The features of his face that used to be round, like his nose and chin, had become sharper. He looked sleeker, more like a predator. He smiled and larger teeth were revealed in the watery reflection before him. His thin tongue was also noticeably longer, and could be extended quite far out from his mouth. The routine they had established earlier with chores in the morning and sword practice in the evening continued, only this time Black Nail was aware of his new anger and tried to suppress it. He had very limited success. No, control your rage. Don't overextend. It leaves you open, Cedar yelled sternly as his wooden blade slid by Black Nail's own and impacted painfully against the hobgoblin's shoulder. Black Nail hissed angrily but tried to do as his master commanded. Control was the key, he thought to himself. I shouldn't do what the anger tells me. He barely managed to block one of Cedar's blows as he fought to remember to keep his stance solid and light. Good, now attack, Cedar yelled. At his command Black Nail's blade swung out at Cedar but the human easily parried it. Black Nail had to fight his instinct to never attack humans, and his new hostile instincts that wanted him to leap forward and claw out Cedar's eyes. This mental clash made his attacks slow. No, too much hesitation. Keep attacking, Cedar told him. Black Nail obeyed and launched a rapid series of attacks, none of which hit. Cedar countered and his wooden blade smacked Black Nail across the head. The hobgoblin felt himself grimace as rage built up inside of him. He wanted to leap at Cedar, to strike out at him, to feel his claws rend Cedar's pinky flesh. He didn't do it though. He had lost control and given in to rage a few times, and Cedar had simply smacked Black Nail down when his wild attack inevitably left him open. No, the only way for him to strike Cedar was to control his rage and learn to use the sword. Wait, so the only way to hit his master was to not want to hit him? Ugh, now he had a headache. Relax, Keep loose and flow through the forms while keeping proper technique, Cedar explained to Black Nail for about the 100th time over the past few days. Black Nail hissed angrily again but tried to as he was told. He desperately wanted to give in and go wild with rage. Days passed this way. Vargas began to take over the sword lessons when Cedar grew too tired. Slowly Black Nail progressed and began to learn. Then one morning Black Nail woke up to find Cedar disassembling his tent. It's time to head back. You're still a crappy swordsman, but I can't stay out here and train you forever. You've managed to learn some discipline though and hopefully that will be enough to keep you out of trouble. Just remember what happens if you screw up, Cedar told Black Nail. I get hung from tree. Black Nail guessed. No, Harad will kill you, Cedar replied. Oh, Black Nail exclaimed. He had almost forgotten about her. Briefly he mentally compared her fight against the ghouls with his own sessions with Cedar. The anger that taken root deep within Black Nail as his new hobgoblin instincts pushed him to fight and dominate everyone around him suddenly shriveled up and died. He was not going to try and fight Harad. Nope, that was never going to happen. Control was his new best friend. Once again Black Nail felt gratitude towards his wise master for working him so hard. Without his lessons he could easily imagine himself losing control, only to be mercilessly killed by Harad seconds later. Come here Black Nail, I have a sort of graduation gift for you, Cedar told him. What's a graduation? He asked his master. He liked the gift part though. It's what happens when you learn something or pass a test. This one is for learning basic swordsmanship and control. Every time you feel angry remember this training. Rage will only lead to self-destruction, Cedar explained. Yes, master, Black Nail replied gratefully. Cedar then handed Black Nail a backpack. Compelled by curiosity the hobgoblin opened the pack and pulled the contents out. It was several sets of clothes and a long hooded cloak. Luckily, when we were leaving camp there were a whole bunch of clothes laying around that no one needed anymore. I picked some of the smaller ones out for you. There's also some other stuff like a flint and steel in there too, Cedar explained. Thank you master, Black Nail told him with real gratitude. For some reason being given human clothes made him happy. Put some on, we can't have you returning to camp dressed like a savage, Cedar replied. Black Nail immediately chose a rough pair of black pants and a brown shirt and pulled them on, after taking off his own self-made shorts. They had been getting kind of tight recently anyway. Much better, you don't look like a feral hobgoblin that just crawled out of the woods anymore, Black Nail's master said with a self-satisfied smile. Yay, I don't know what he looks like now, Vargas added. Black Nail resisted the urge to claw the man's eyes out. And here's the real prize. Just remember your training, or I'll kill you myself, Cedar told Black Nail as he pulled out a simple sheathed short sword and presented it hilt first to Black Nail. Oddly enough, that's almost exactly what my drill instructor told me the day I graduated from basic, Vargas mused quietly to himself off to the side. Black Nail took the blade and purred in pleasure. Now he had a sword all of his own. His master Cedar trusted him with one, and had even shown him how to use it. Black Nail unsheathed the blade and smiled at its shiny and ever so sharp edges. He ran his finger along the blade so he could feel it cut into his skin. As a tiny drop of blood formed on his finger and Black Nail chuckled gleefully. Vargas was suddenly looking like he doubted this was a good idea. His eyes were slightly wide with concern, as if he expected Black Nail to go on a killing spree any second now. The hobgoblin decided to disappoint him. He felt humbled by his master's loyalty and promised himself he would return it. He would practice every day so that he would never give in to his anger and disappoint his master. Thank you, master. Black Nail your loyal servant, he said as he knelt and lowered his eyes submissively. Get up Black Nail, you earned that blade. Now let's get back to camp. It's been over a week, and everyone probably thinks we're dead, Cedar told him. With a nod of acceptance Black Nail attached his new sword and sheath to his waist. That done he put on the dark grey cloak, and looked back to admire himself in it. It reminded him of Cedar and Harad's cloaks, and made him feel important. He liked it. He flipped the hood up and over his face. Ugh, you can hardly tell he's a hobgoblin. That's more than a little scary, Vargas commented uneasily. From within the depths of his cloak Black Nail smiled gleefully, and his long naked tongue flipped out to taste the cool air. A whole new world lay on the path before him, if he simply had the will and discipline to walk it. Written in blood too. It only took them a few hours to get back to camp. There had been no real reason for Cedar to travel further than that. He had simply wanted some space and isolation while he trained Black Nail, so that no one got accidentally murdered. Well, I'm glad this little adventure is over with, Vargas told Cedar as they approached the camp. Consider your debt paid, Cedar replied as he walked. Oh, I do. I'm just glad this crazy hobgoblin idea of yours hasn't gotten us killed, yet, Vargas said. You volunteered, Cedar reminded the other man. I wasn't going to let you wander off into the deep green alone for days on end, with no company but a hobgoblin. Besides, I was curious to see if you could pull it off, Vargas told him. I did, Cedar answered gruffly. Probably, Vargas added with a backward glance at Black Nail. The hobgoblin was walking along behind them with his hood still up. He liked how the hood concealed him, even if it was a little hot. The way it hid his form was an advantage he could use. He had been thinking a lot about how to act and what to do when he got back to the rest of the tribe. Black Nail had been following the conversation between Cedar and Vargas with great interest. Over the past few days he had noticed that it was much easier for him to follow the human language. He had learned quite a bit simply from listening to Vargas and Cedar speak, but he wanted to learn even more. He looked up and returned Vargas' gaze. I thank SSU for the training. I owe you a debt, Black Nail told him in his hiss-like voice. Sure, no problem, Vargas replied as he blinked in surprise. Black Nail smiled at Vargas' response. He planned on trying to fit in, so he could eventually take on a higher position within the tribe. Black Nail had absolutely no intention of staying at the bottom of the hierarchy anymore. Just because he couldn't climb it by challenging the other members of the tribe didn't mean he couldn't do it at all. First, he would try making alliances, and if that didn't work he would find another way. Obstacles could be removed. As they walked they came across a sentry, who looked up but made no comment as they passed. He apparently saw nothing odd about the two scouts returning to camp with another cloaked person in tow. Vargas looked like he really wanted to say something to the man, but stopped himself. Black Nail just smirked to himself in amusement. He could have walked right up to that sentry and bitten him before the man even realized anything was odd. As they entered the camp proper, Vargas said a brief goodbye, and they split up to go to their respective campsites. The camp itself had changed a fair bit since Black Nail had seen it last. The timbers that had been lying around before had now been put to use. Lean-tos were steadily being replaced by crude log buildings. Cedar and Black Nail passed quite a few people on their way through the camp. Few of camp's residents gave the pair a second glance. In fact, a lot of them were unfamiliar to Black Nail. Herad must have really been pushing the recruitment while we were away, Cedar commented as he observed the people around them. Yes, I see and smell us as many strangers, Black Nail said in response. He had decided to work on his human by talking as much as possible. What in all the hells? Someone is camping in our spot. Cedar suddenly exclaimed angrily. Black Nail looked up to see that his master was right. Where Cedar's tent used to stand, and some of their gear still did, another group of humans had set up their own stuff. Black Nail's eyes narrowed as he eyed the humans that had entered his territory. That was a challenge. There were 3 of them, 1 woman and 2 men. They were lounging around and seemed to be relaxing. Black Nail thought they looked rather young for humans. They didn't have a tent but they had some sleeping rolls set up under a crude shelter made of branches and a tarp. Cedar stomped over to them, and Black Nail followed. This is my spot, and that's my stuff, he barked at them. The 2 men got up and turned towards Cedar as he spoke, but the woman remained where she was lying against some bags. She just looked up and frowned at Cedar and Black Nail before apparently disregarding them and turning away. We've been here for days, one of the men told Cedar dismissively. I've been away on a mission for Herad, boy, Cedar replied with hostility plain in his voice and manner. Black Nail felt his own anger rise and his heartbeat pick up in response to his master's tone of voice. She didn't say nothing when we set up here, the young man replied with a shrug. Cedar frowned and his hand moved closer to his dagger. The one young man noticed and his expression became more belligerent. The other man smelled nervous to Black Nail though, like stale sweat. Come on Danaf, we just got here. We don't need to turn this into a fight. Remember Herad's rules, he whispered to his companion. Black Nail's large ears heard him though, and he remembered Herad's rules. One of them was not fighting without her permission. That would make this tricky. It's not our problem if he starts something. Besides, we need to show everyone here that they can't boss us around just because we're new. Especially, when it's just an old man and some cloaked pipsqueak, the first man replied without taking his eyes from Cedar. I'm trying to nap here boys, can't you just get these guys to leave, the girl asked as she sat up. Just a second, Danaf replied as he tried to stare down Cedar. His gaze shifted to Black Nail as the hobgoblin moved forward and out from behind Cedar. Their eyes met for a single moment, and something stirred in Black Nail. He wanted to put this man in his place. Without warning, Black Nail growled, and pounced forward as instinct took over. His target froze in shock at what he saw under the hobgoblin's hood, and before he could recover, Black Nail had closed the distance between them. The hobgoblin reached out and grabbed his opponent's knife hand, with enough force that his claws pierced the man's skin and drew blood. A quick kick to the back of his leg sent the man to his knees, and before he could regain his balance, Black Nail was behind him with a firm grasp on his neck. As the man struggled, Black Nail leaned down and smiled at him. Then he opened his mouth wide and growled menacingly. Everyone froze. Danaf was white as snow and his eyes were wide with terror as the hobgoblin's toothy maw opened mere inches from his face. Black Nail smelled the scent of human urine fill the air. Our spot, leave, he growled slowly as he pushed Danaf away. His rage burned like fire within him, but Black Nail held it in check. What the fuck, the woman screeched as Black Nail's inhuman visage was revealed. As the man called Danaf scrambled across the ground away from him, Black Nail turned towards her and leered. With a scream of terror the woman fled, and Danaf was right behind her. The third member of their group was long gone by this point. He had run and abandoned his friends the second Black Nail had attacked. Black Nail chuckled to himself as he watched the humans flee. Their cowardice reminded him of goblins. His smile grew even wider as the humans reached the edge of the clearing, and kept going into the forest. That was really funny. They had to be very stupid to think they were safer out in woods. Surprise really was a powerful weapon. It hadn't even been a fight really, he had barely touched even one of them. No one had gotten hurt, much, so no one could complain to Herad. The dozens of bandits and ruffians who were nearby had all stopped, and were staring at either the fleeing humans or Black Nail. Most of them were too far away to get a good look at Black Nail, and simply looked confused by what had happened. Even Cedar was looking at Black Nail with a startled expression, but he quickly recovered. Good job Black Nail, he told the hobgoblin hesitantly. Just remember to keep yourself under control, and don't eat anyone. Yes, master, the hobgoblin replied happily. Cedar then noticed all the people staring at them, dismissed them, and walked over to where his stuff was stored. Once there he began to grumble and go through it to make sure everything was still there. Black Nail could hear everyone around him muttering, but when all he did was stand there and wait for his master, most the people went back to their own business. As he was waiting, his ears twitched as he picked up the sound of someone approaching. "Ah, Cedar, I knew you must have come back." The screams and people madly dashing about everywhere were rather conclusive signs, announced a voice Black Nail recognized as Geralt's. "I saw those fresh-faced recruits fleeing into the woods and I thought to myself, what could be so horrible that someone would run towards the forest? And that's when it hit me, Cedar must be back," Geralt explained as he approached. Cedar looked up and scowled at him. Black Nail watched Geralt approach from where he was standing off to the side. "What do you want?" Cedar asked the other man. Geralt smiled before replying. "Why wouldn't I come over and make sure one of my closest friends in the entire band made it back all right after such a long absence? So, where is Black Nail anyway?" Geralt asked as he looked around. Cedar rolled his eyes disdainfully and pointed towards the hobgoblin before turning back to sorting out all his stuff. Black Nail flipped his hood down to reveal his thin green face and the two small horns that rose from his skull. "Yes, I'm here." "Hello, Geralt," Black Nail told a now thoroughly shocked-looking Geralt. The man's smile was crooked as he stared dumbly at Black Nail. "About time something shut that boy up," Cedar mumbled from where he was working. "By the gods, it is you!" Geralt blurted out. "Yes, I'm Black Nail," Black Nail told him again. Geralt had never been the smartest human around, but Black Nail doubted even he could mistake the hobgoblin for anyone else in camp. "You're so much taller," Geralt remarked. "Yes," Black Nail replied dryly. How long was Geralt going to keep stating the obvious? He was beginning to question the man's value as a possible ally. "It's just amazing how much you've changed in such a short time," Geralt exclaimed as he approached the hobgoblin curiously. Black Nail didn't know how to respond to that, so he just shrugged casually. Looking back, it was obvious the man was right. Black Nail felt like an entirely different person than he had been mere weeks ago. It was very strange, and somewhat uncomfortable to think about. So he didn't. Geralt walked up and began peering closely at the hobgoblin. Black Nail had to resist the urge to growl and push him away. The human was uncomfortably close. Only Black Nail's familiarity with the thin man prevented him from at least backing away. Was there something he should say now? "Hey, I'll have to start bringing you bigger treats. I hope you still like jerky," Geralt told the hobgoblin as he handed him a piece of meat. There was a somewhat embarrassed look on his face. This time Black Nail's answering smile wasn't forced. "Yes, ISS do," he answered before taking the meat and stuffing it in his mouth. His almost inexhaustible hunger was one of the few things that hadn't changed since his metamorphosis. He had been eating quite a bit since he'd awoken as a hobgoblin, but he still was never quite satisfied. "Thank you, my friend Geralt," he told the man after he'd chewed the morsel down to nothing. "I'm glad to see that you are still mostly the same on the inside. Your impressive new grasp of Elorian excluded, of course. I knew Red Dog was being an idiot when he told everyone you would turn into some sort of ravenous beast when you changed. I'm glad you're back, my not-so-little friend," Geralt remarked happily. Black Nail heard a groan full of disbelief and annoyance from where Cedar was working as Geralt finished speaking. The hobgoblin pretended he hadn't heard anything though and nodded happily at Geralt. That's when he noticed the sword at Geralt's hip. He had seen the sword there before, of course, but never really noticed it before now. An idea then popped into the hobgoblin's head. He raised a green clawed hand and pointed to the blade. "Want to practice?" he asked the man. At first Geralt had seemed confused by what Black Nail had said, but then he followed Black Nail's gaze and then noticed the sword at the hobgoblin's own hip. "Cedar's been teaching you swordsmanship?" he asked in surprise. Black Nail was fairly sure that Geralt had meant it as a statement, and not a question. Sometimes he had trouble figuring that out. "Yes, for discipline," Black Nail replied. I'd like to, but," Geralt hesitantly answered. "Let me stop you there," Cedar interjected, as he got up and walked over. "We should go report to Herad, but don't worry, Black Nail. I'll get Borsha to practice with you later. She loves that kind of thing." Black Nail felt his heart sink as Cedar spoke. He had come to like practicing with swords, and he suspected sparring with Geralt wouldn't be as one-sided as he was used to. Geralt however threw Cedar a grateful smile. He apparently hadn't been looking forward to sparring with a hobgoblin. "I'll see you two around," he told them before he walked off. "Let's go," Cedar said when Geralt was gone. He immediately started walking over to the farmhouse where Herad had set up camp. Black Nail pulled his hood back up and followed him, but he had to drag himself as reluctance made his feet feel heavy. Sparring with Geralt, or even Borsha, sounded like a lot more fun than going to see Herad. Black Nail wasn't looking forward to seeing Herad again at all. He half believed she would kill him on the spot, for being a threat to her. Given a choice, he would have avoided the bloodthirsty chieftain for as long as possible. Before they reached the old home, Cedar unexpectedly veered off track. Black Nail looked over towards where his master was heading and saw Herad taking a walk through the camp. He froze in fright for a second, but then forced himself to head her way. At first it didn't seem like Herad saw them, but then she turned their way. Black Nail felt himself grow a little sweatier under his cloak. He wanted to pull the hood down even more but didn't want to draw attention to himself that way either. As they got closer, Black Nail was struck by how much shorter Herad seemed now that he was a hobgoblin. In fact, she wasn't really larger than him. That seemed very weird to him, but he wasn't stupid enough to think that made her weak though. He'd seen one very large human make that mistake. "Ah, Cedar, I had heard you were B, Harad started to say before stopping, and staring at the cloaked black nail. At first she looked suspicious, but then she began to snarl in anger. Please tell me a hobgoblin, in a hood, didn't walk right by my sentries. Heads are going to roll if it's been strolling freely through my camp for the last few hours, in a hood, and no one thought to inform me or even knew, she hissed at them. Both Cedar and Black Nail went completely still. Very slowly and carefully Black Nail slouched to make himself a smaller target and less threatening. Maybe if he was lucky enough to survive her first blow he could play dead and then find a hole to hide in. I'm informing you right now, Cedar responded quickly but calmly. We briefly stopped to unpack and then went straight to look for you. Black Nail could smell his nervousness though. He was simply very good at hiding it. Harad eyed them both hostilely but seemed to calm down a little, but only a little. She raised a finger on her gloved hand at Black Nail, and he had to fight the urge to join the bandits he had chased off earlier and make a break for the woods. Lose the hood, she told him, with an edge to her voice sharp enough to draw blood. The hobgoblin pulled his hood down as quickly as he could. He lowered his eyes submissively and stared at her boots. Harad simply observed him silently for a few seconds. Are you a hobgoblin or an oversized lizard? Look at me, she ordered him. Reluctantly Black Nail raised his head and met her eyes. They were dark and hostile. Did she want to fight him? Hopefully she just wanted to make him submit. Submitting would be fine with him. In fact, he would do it right now. Your servant Black Nail greets you, chieftain, he told her. He then gave her his best impression of a friendly human smile. It wasn't a very good impression, but it did give her a nice view of his teeth. Harad looked at him blankly for a second, and then chuckled. Both Cedar and Black Nail were taken aback. This is what Red Dog was so afraid of? It's just a slightly bigger goblin, still small and cowardly, she laughed coldly. Cedar turned and frowned at Black Nail, and then looked back at Harad. Black Nail's pride was somewhat hurt by Harad's remark. He's only been a hob for a few days. He'll grow some more, and he's not cowardly. He's just perceptive, and has a beast's instincts. Hobgoblins are clever and Black Nail knows an opponent he can't beat when he sees one, so he's acting accordingly, Cedar explained defensively. Harad threw him a doubtful look. Black Nail usually liked being complimented, but now he really wished Cedar would stop talking. Just ask around if you don't believe me. He took down one of your new recruits before the fool and his two friends even knew what was happening. They were so scared they hightailed it off into the woods, screaming all the way. You're going to have to send scouts out to find them if you want them back, he added. So that was your pet, was it? I was just about to investigate that disturbance, she mused. He seems weak to you because that's what he wants you to think. He's being submissive towards a strong pack leader. Don't underestimate hobgoblins. Hood or no hood, a few sentries wouldn't stop Black Nail from slipping into camp and slitting some throats come nightfall, Cedar continued to explain. But I am SS your servant and friend and won't ever cut SS your band, Black Nail interjected nervously as he gave Harad another smile. What was his master trying to do? If it's so clever, why are you so sure you have it under control? Harad asked Cedar, while ignoring Black Nail. He's too smart to pick fights he can't win. I just had to train him to control himself and make sure he knew who the boss was, Cedar replied with a shrug. That would be me, but now I'm curious. How exactly did the great ranger Cedar manage to be the first to train a hobgoblin? She asked him with a smirk. Sword drills and sparring are the best thing for teaching discipline, Cedar replied deadpan. Harad gave Cedar a look. It clearly indicated he was either an idiot or insane, possibly both. Then she burst out laughing. Black Nail actually flinched away from her at the unexpected outburst, but Cedar took it in stride. By the gods, you amuse me sometimes, Cedar. No wonder no one has done it before. Who would be stupid or mad enough to teach a hobgoblin how to use a sword? It's brilliant in its pure bloody insanity, she cackled. Her laughter faded after a while, and she actually wiped a tear from her eye. I can't wait to see the look on Red Dog's face when he learns about this. You just keep teaching your hobgoblin how to kill people, Cedar. I think I'm going to enjoy having him around. Oh, and when he's gotten proficient enough I want you to send him my way for a few rounds. That ought to be interesting, Harad told Cedar, as amusement oozed from her voice. Without waiting for an answer the bandit leader started walking away from them, still chuckling to herself. Her black cloak trailed behind her as she went. When she was gone Black Nail turned to his master, and couldn't help but give him a dirty look. Why had he told Harad all that? Black Anil could think of nothing he would like to do less than fight Harad. Don't give me that look, you jumped up goblin, Cedar told him. Bah, you were acting all pathetic back there. It was shameful. You should be thanking me, now she likes you. That didn't make Black Nail feel any better. He had much preferred his own plan. Black Nail felt it would have involved a much smaller chance of dying. He had a feeling that when he fought Harad that they wouldn't be using wooden blades. Written in blood 3. The man known as Ferret strolled off into the woods towards the camp latrines. The large rough-shaven bandit had been lounging around the bandit camp for a while, but now nature's call had lured him out into the forest. From where he was sitting and watching from another corner of the camp Black Nail smiled. It was not a friendly smile, but one meant to display both teeth and menace. After a quick look around to make sure no one was paying attention, he slowly got up and slipped off into the trees. Most of the bandits in the camp simply avoided the hobgoblin, several were more hostile though. Among the most vocal about their distrust of Black Nail was Ferret. Ferret had made his hatred for Black Nail plain at every opportunity. He spent a great deal of time trying to turn the other humans against the hobgoblin, and had even threatened to kill the hobgoblin. Worse, he had threatened Cedar. That would have to stop. Besides, Black Nail owed the man one for when he had threatened him the first day his master had freed him. Black Nail stalked through the woods silently. He had removed the boots Cedar had given him. He found it easier to move undetected without them. He had also removed his cloak. His green skin was actually harder to see in the forest, and the cloak tended to get caught on things. Nearly invisible, the hobgoblin circled the camp towards the latrines and his prey. He slipped noiselessly between the trees and bushes. Anticipation for the hunt gleamed in his eyes. Soon the cracking of breaking twigs and the whooshing sound of human breath reached his ears. With his prey located, he stopped to observe and plan for a moment from behind a nearby tree. Ferret's back was to the goblin and his pants were down around his ankles. He was busy emptying his bladder. Black Nail took advantage of his distraction and stalked forward towards him. The sound of bird calls and Ferret's own noise masked Black Nail's quiet approach. Ferret continued to urinate unaware as Black Nail closed the distance between them. When he stood directly behind his target, Black Nail drew his dagger, but then the hobgoblin hesitated. He had never actually assaulted a human before without his rage driving him. Part of him doubted he could pull it off. Ferret was not a small man. However, another part of Black Nail urged him forward. He had seen humans fight and die many times now. A good blade could end them easily enough, and Ferret was a threat to him and his master. The hobgoblin made up his mind. Black Nail kicked the man's feet out from under him. With a startled Ferret fell forward over the latrine pit. He flailed as he tipped forward and desperately tried to find some way to steady himself, but before he could fall into the latrine, Black Nail reached out and wrenched him backwards. The hobgoblin's long thin fingers entwined themselves through the man's hair as he pulled the man up. Before the man could yell and draw attention, Black Nail reached around and rested his blade against Ferret's throat. The rough bandit stiffened and froze in alarm as he hung unsteadily over the pit. From this close, Black Nail could hear his heart pounding. The edge of his knife put pressure on the man's skin but didn't draw blood, yet. "Hello SS, Ferret," Black Nail whispered as he leaned in and licked the side of the man's face. The bandit's skin was salty with sweat. Ferret shuddered in horror. "What do you want?" the bandit stuttered fearfully. "Silence, yours. I have heard you try and turn the band against me. You challenge me," Black Nail answered. "You're not part of the band. You're a stupid beast. Kill me if you want, but then everyone will know you for the vicious animal you are, and then they will hunt you down," Ferret replied angrily. Black Nail let his dagger drop, and then stabbed Ferret in the leg. The bandit hissed in pain and flinched, but Black Nail held him tightly. A few seconds later the large man went limp and loose in the hobgoblin's grip. Black Nail sheathed his poisoned dagger, and drew a rock from one of his pouches. "I thank you for permission to end your life," Black Nail told the man he had paralyzed with spider poison taken from Cedar's bags. Emotionlessly he then smashed the man in the head with the rock, creating a small gash that bled freely, and let the body and the rock fall into the latrine together. The bandit landed head first, with a loud wet splat. Much to Black Nail's satisfaction, his face was submerged in the collected human excrement, where the paralyzed and most likely unconscious bandit would drown. His chore complete, Black Nail got up from where he was crouched beside the latrine pit, and headed back to the camp. He circled the camp instead of heading straight back to the clearing, as not to draw suspicion down on himself. Hopefully, he would be back to where he had been sitting before anyone even noticed he had left. He hadn't actually followed Ferret planning to kill him. He had been planning to simply scare him into submission. However, the unthinking hatred he had seen in the man's eyes had convinced him that wouldn't work. Ferret had been a danger and would have never accepted Black Nail into the band. Everything had worked out though. Anyone that found the body would probably think Ferret had fallen in and hit his head, and then drowned in the latrine. With all the footprints from the heavy traffic to and from the latrine, no one would notice his own prints. Black Nail smiled at his own cleverness. Cedar would probably even approve, not that Black Nail was ever going to tell him. He emerged from the bushes at the border of the clearing and casually strolled into the bandits' camp. No one even looked his way. Once he reached the pile of firewood he had been sitting on earlier, he picked up his discarded cloak, and put it back on. That done, the hobgoblin decided to head back to Cedar's campsite. His master probably had tasks for him to complete. As he moved through the camp, most of the human moved out of his way and threw him wary glances. Word had spread about who and what was under his cloak. Black Nail found it amusing. He didn't wear the cloak to make people less uneasy around him, he wore it because it made them more afraid. Not really knowing what he looked like was what upset them the most. He suspected the larger and heavier humans would grow accustomed to his presence quickly if he took off his cloak and simply spent time around them. For now though, he wanted to make sure they didn't disregard him. Fear would help make him equal in their eyes and secure him a higher position within the band, without the need for violence, or at least less of it. Black Nail arrived at the camp he shared with Cedar. Beside Cedar's tent, the hobgoblin had dug a shallow hole and built a small lean-to over it from twine, branches, and grass. It was little more than a dry place to sleep and store a few things, but that was all he needed. Cedar wasn't around, so Black Nail strolled off to find him. Eventually he found his master by the road. He was watching a group of people approach the camp. Black Nail walked over to join him. He was curious what was going on. He hadn't heard about anything important happening today. "There you are, Black Nail. Decided to stop lazing about, did ye?" Cedar remarked. "Yes, master." "What is this?" Black Nail asked. His master seemed to be looking at the approaching people with disapproval. "The last of Herad's recruits. She must have hired every petty thief and thug in Riverbend to get as many as she has. Most of them won't last long." She's probably planning on simply letting most of them die and keeping the survivors, he explained disapprovingly. Black Nail studied the group coming down the road. He recognized Red Dog leading them. Behind him were around 24 men and women. Only 3 or 4 seemed familiar to Black Nail. When they arrived, Red Dog recognized the hobgoblin and gave him a nasty look. Black Nail simply smiled back at him, and made sure to flash as many teeth as possible. He knew the man wasn't a real threat to him. He would never dare go against Herod's wishes. Red Dog chose to ignore Black Nail, and turned to Cedar instead. I see your pet hasn't managed to kill you yet, Cedar, the bandit remarked. I'm not the one that needs to be afraid, Cedar responded cryptically. Did I miss anything important while I was gone? Red Dog asked the other man, as he frowned at Cedar's response. Yes, they passed out the good manners. Too bad you weren't here, Cedar replied with an amused tone. Very funny, old man. Why don't you use some of that matchless experience of yours and show some of these baby-faced recruits around while I go talk to Herod, Red Dog told him with a roll of his eyes. Before Cedar could answer back, though, someone Black Nail had never seen before walked up behind Red Dog and spoke. Who is this old man, Dog? A young human female asked as she leaned out from behind him. The bandit lieutenant cringed slightly as she spoke. The girl had short-cut red hair, and was about average size for a human female. She smiled excitedly as she looked Cedar over. You're recruiting children now? Cedar asked Red Dog disdainfully. I'm over 17 winters, the girl interjected. She seemed very annoyed at being called a child. Red Dog shrugged. I told her to screw off the first time she showed up, but then several of the other people I tried to recruit dropped out with mysterious knife wounds. Seemed like a good idea to just let her come at that point, he explained. The redhead smiled again as Red Dog spoke, and she winked at Cedar conspiratorially. Cedar looked the girl over carefully. Who are you running from, girl? He asked her. Name's Kita, and I dunno what you are talking about. Maybe, I just wanted to serve under a famous swordswoman like Herod, she replied. Cedar grunted and gave her a skeptical look. Those are gang colors you're wearing. The gangs look down on bandits, and they don't take kindly to their members quitting either. That tells me you were looking for a quick exit from Riverbend when you joined up with us. So tell me, who are you running from? He responded dryly. Kita narrowed her eyes and gave him Cedar a hostile stare, but then relented under the pressure of his steady gaze. Ugh, fine, maybe I kinda stabbed someone I shouldn't have, she explained. Who and why? An unsurprised Cedar asked her. Her mouth twisted into a frown as she considered whether to answer him. My boss girl. Bitch thought she could take my stuff just because she was shacking up with Klavik, our leader, she explained reluctantly. Cedar turned to Red Dog. This is wonderful new recruit you've gotten for us, Cedar told him sarcastically. Red Dog shrugged again. She's here now, so she's not my problem anymore. Thank the gods, he told Cedar with an amused grin. He then turned and walked back towards the other people he had recruited, leaving Kita with Black Nail and Cedar. As Red Dog left, Kita seemed to notice Black Nail for the first time. She looked over the cloaked figure suspiciously. What's with the cloaked freak? She just gonna stand there all day? She asked. Black Nail twitched as she mentioned him. She had confused his gender. Oh right, human females were smaller than males, so she thought he was one of them. It was still kind of insulting for some reason. He decided he didn't like her. Black Nail took a long step towards the girl that removed most the distance between them, and straightened up to look her directly in the eye. Then he swept his cloak back behind him and flipped his hood down dramatically to fully reveal his inhuman visage. The girl's eyes went wide and she took a step forward. Black Nail froze in confusion and the grin slipped from his face as he took in Kita's delighted smile. A hobgoblin. I can't believe this gang has a hobgoblin in it. That's the sharpest thing I've ever heard, she squealed in delight. Black Nail took a step back away from her nervously. Her unusual lack of fear unnerved him. Cedar looked more than a little taken aback as well. What's your name? How many people have you killed? Do you know any secret hobgoblin stuff? She asked Black Nail excitedly as she took another step towards him. Black Nail growled menacingly, but that failed to deter her approach. He threw Cedar a panicked look. He didn't know how to get the female away from him without drawing a blade, and he had a feeling that would be frowned upon. Cedar rolled his eyes but stepped forward and placed a hand on the girl's shoulder. Stop harassing my hobgoblin, he told her. Who were you again? Kita asked him as she turned and pushed his hand off her shoulder. I'm Cedar, a scout. Now come with me, he told her. Why should I go anywhere with you, creep? She asked him hostilely. Cedar scowled down at her. Because the hobgoblin goes where I go, he answered her dryly. Come on Black Nail, let's go see Vorsha, he then ordered Black Nail. The hobgoblin was more than eager to obey, and put some distance between him and the human female. Cedar walked off towards the camp, and Black Nail shadowed him closely. Just in case Cedar needed to put himself between him and the girl again. The girl watched them walk off for a few seconds before sighing and running after them. Fine, where are we going? If you're trying to get into my pants I'll bite your bits off. She told Cedar. Black Nail's master grimaced in distaste and gave her an insulted look, as he continued walking. People gave them odd glances as they made their way through the bandit camp. I'm taking you to Vorsha, Cedar explained. Why? Kita asked. Because, she loves dealing with hopeless cases like you, Cedar told her gruffly. Kita gave him a mean look, but continued following them. Does the hobgoblin talk? She suddenly asked. Yes, Cedar replied without looking back at her. He looked very annoyed to Black Nail. Why isn't it talking now, she then asked. Why don't you ask him, Cedar answered in annoyance. Then he turned to the hobgoblin. Answer her questions, Black Nail, he commanded the goblin, before muttering so she'll leave me alone. Black Nail grimaced. He didn't want to have to deal with this clearly insane youngling, but he had to do as his master ordered. Yes, master, he responded, but frustration was clear in his voice. He does talk. Why are you wearing that cloak, is it magic, she asked excitedly. No, I like it, Black Nail answered her. Clearly she was both stupid and insane. Black Nail didn't know a lot about magic, but even he knew it was rare and had absolutely nothing to do with goblins. Black Nail sighed in relief as he spotted Vorsha and Geralt up ahead at their campsite. They were seated right outside the large tent Vorsha shared with Geralt. Vorsha, Cedar yelled. I got something here for you. The muscular woman stood up and looked their way. Black Nail thought giving the girl to Vorsha was a great idea. Black Nail wasn't quite sure what the warrior would do with her, but he didn't really care as long as she was kept far away from him. Why do you have a little girl, Cedar? She's not yours, I hope, Vorsha asked with amused concern. Cedar shuddered in revulsion at the very idea of Kida being his daughter. No, or at least I pray to the gods she isn't. Red Dog recruited her, apparently she insisted. I thought I should introduce you too, since I know how you like to pick up strays, Cedar replied. Vorsha looked Kida over and frowned. I might have to have a talk with Red Dog about this, she remarked with more than a hint of threat in her voice. You do that, Cedar responded indifferently. As the two bandits had been talking, Kida had been staring at Vorsha with an impressed expression on her face. Gods, you're big, she suddenly blurted out. And you're tiny, Vorsha responded with an amused smile. Black Nail knew Vorsha was very hard to insult. Maybe that was why Cedar wanted her to teach him. I'm not tiny. I'm over 17 winters old. You're just huge, the affronted Kida replied. Vorsha looked Cedar's way. Well, thanks I guess Cedar. I wasn't looking for a new project right now, but I'm sure as death not going to let her wander around by herself either, she told him. I don't need any help. I can take care of myself. Kida said as if she had been insulted. That might have been true in the city, but out here things are a bit different, Vorsha told her. The large woman looked the girl over carefully. Have you ever used a sword? Vorsha then asked her. How could I? They're kinda hard to hide, and the city guards don't like people other than blue bloods having them. Besides, knives work just fine, Kida explained in a tone that suggested only idiots wouldn't already know all this already. Black Nail smirked at the girl. He knew how to use a sword, sort of. There aren't any guards out here, so everyone has swords or worse. If you're going to survive a week out here you're going to need to learn to use one too, Vorsha explained. That reminds me, I wanted to pass off some of Black Nail's sword training to you as well, Cedar interjected. Kida's eyes suddenly gleamed with excitement. If the hobgoblin's going to be there then I'm in, she exclaimed. Vorsha threw the girl a confused look, and Black Nail felt a sudden spike of concern at the unexpected direction the conversation had abruptly taken. You want to practice sword fighting with a hobgoblin? Vorsha asked Kida in disbelief. Yay, he's so sharp and scary looking, she answered enthusiastically. And this makes you want to train with him? Vorsha asked again. Yep, Kida said. Vorsha sighed. Well, whatever works I guess. What do you think, Cedar? Vorsha asked him. Black Nail should be fine. It might even help with his control. It's not like they'll be sparring against each other right off the bat anyway, Cedar answered her. Looks like I'll be training these two together then, she remarked as she eyed Black Nail and the grinning Kida. This is certainly not how I expected to be spending the next little while. Me too, the hobgoblin muttered as he looked over at the young woman grinning at him. His life had just gotten a little more complicated, and a lot more annoying. Written in blood 4. Training with Vorsha was much more enjoyable than with Cedar. It was actually kind of fun. For one thing, she tended to hit Black Nail a lot less. For another, he learned quite a bit faster from her. This was most likely because he took fewer blows to the head. Good, keep your weight mostly on your back foot, Vorsha told him as he blocked one of her thrusts. The tall chesty brunette was obviously not putting all of her considerable strength behind the blow. Now attack, she told him. The hobgoblin eagerly did as she asked. He stepped forwards and launched a horizontal slash, which Vorsha easily blocked. Not that he had been expecting to land the blow. No, that was all wrong. You were off balance. Stop, Vorsha said with a frown. I'm sorry, Black Nail replied submissively as he lowered his blade. The large woman was not only clearly a much more skilled fighter than him, but as they trained her impressive muscles were very obvious as well. Black Nail mentally added her to the list of people he didn't want to challenge to a real fight. See, do it like this, Vorsha explained. The large brunette's blade sliced through the air as she demonstrated the proper technique. Black Nail watched her carefully. She was startlingly graceful looking when she had a sword in hand. As she flowed between different stances and attacks her brown curls barely moved. Black Nail tried to copy her movements but his weren't nearly as smooth. He certainly had a long way to go in order to become any good at swordsmanship. He would just have to cheat in the meantime. Good, now practice that by yourself for a while I go check on Kida, Vorsha told him as she watched him practice. Black Nail continued repeatedly slicing the air as he practiced the move over and over again. Vorsha gave an approving nod and then headed over to Kida. She then walked over to where the young woman was practicing, or where she was supposed to be practicing anyway. Kida had stopped practicing quite a while ago, and was now just standing around. The young woman was red-faced with exhaustion, and the sword she was supposed to be swinging hung loosely from her hand with its tip resting on the ground. She scowled at Vorsha as the older woman approached. "Why have you stopped?" Vorsha asked her in disapproval. "Ugh, I can barely move my arms anymore. Can't I take a break?" Kida whined in response. "Ha, and you thought you didn't need anyone's help? It hasn't even been half an hour yet. Real fighting takes a little more muscle than that back alley scuffling you're used to, doesn't it now?" Vorsha asked her. "Maybe," Kida muttered resentfully back. "Well, don't worry about it. I'll have you in fighting form before too long. It will just take a few hours of practice every day," she explained with a gleeful smile. Kida winced as if someone had just slapped her across the face. She didn't seem to like Vorsha's plan very much. "I don't suppose I have a choice," she asked the other woman. "Nope, I already got permission from Harad to make you my subordinate. You have to do what I say, or it's back to the city with you," Vorsha replied with a smile. Kida groaned. While they were talking, Blacknail had grown bored of repeating the same technique, so he started throwing in a few other ones. He was so engrossed in the feel and sound of the blade as it sliced through the air that he didn't notice Cedar and Red Dog arrive until one of them actually spoke. "Blacknail, come here," Cedar called out to him. The hobgoblin flinched in surprise at the unexpected voice. He recovered quickly though, and then walked over to his master. He dropped his blunt practice blade on the way over. "Hello SS, Master and Red Dog," Blacknail said as walked over to them. Red Dog's expression was unusually neutral. He didn't scowl at the hobgoblin. Instead he just regarded him without judgment. "We have a job for you, hobgoblin," Red Dog told him. "Oh, what SS is it?" Blacknail asked with obvious interest. Red Dog wouldn't be here talking to him unless it was something out of the ordinary. "There's a small group of army deserters who have set up camp to the south. They're robbing, and usually killing, travelers. Harad wants them dealt with and made an example of," Red Dog explained. "Men hunt in our territory, so we SS kill them," Blacknail summarized. "Basically, yes. Harad does want some of them alive though, they'll make better recruits than most the riffraff we've been getting from Riverbend," the bandit replied as he threw a disdainful look at Kida. Blacknail agreed with Red Dog about the uselessness of the one named Kida, but had to suppress the urge to remind Red Dog that he was the idiot who had recruited her. "They're hiding in the forest somewhere, so you'll be helping me track them down," Cedar added. "I understand, Master," Blacknail replied as he nodded. "How many men are you taking?" Vorsha asked. She had dismissed Kida and joined them as well. "Only a little more than a dozen, and I see you've joined Cedar in this insanity," Red Dog replied with a nod in Blacknail's direction. "I mean fine, so he's useful to have around. That doesn't mean you should be training the hobgoblin to kill people better. Can no one else seriously see why that's obviously such a bad idea? He's actually a very well-behaved student, and learns fairly quickly," Vorsha replied with a shrug. "That doesn't really make me feel any better," Red Dog told her dryly. "You can whine all you want on the way there. Let's get going," Cedar interjected impatiently. Red Dog's lips curled up in displeasure as he responded. "Fine, whatever. We've got the goblin, so let's head out," Red Dog replied in exasperation. He also seemed eager to get the job over with. After a brief stop to grab some stuff from his shelter, Blacknail and the bandits were on their way down the road. Just like Red Dog had told Vorsha earlier, their group was comprised of about 24 people, with an about even mix of new and experienced bandits. "Couldn't we have used some of the horses?" one of the recruits complained as she walked beside Red Dog. They had been walking down the old dirt road that cut through the forest for several hours now. "There are too many of us for that. Besides, we aren't going all that far, and we'll be moving through a lot of bush. You'll just have to get used to walking distances further than down the street," Red Dog told her disdainfully. "And riding can be even more painful and exhausting than walking if you're not used to it," Cedar added. Suddenly Blacknail heard something from up ahead. He froze, pulled his hood down, and listened. Everyone else noticed his actions and stopped as well. Most of them had curious looks on their faces. A few had apparently managed to somehow forget he was a hobgoblin, and looked shocked at his appearance. "Horses, many of them." From ahead, Blacknail announced as he stared up into the trees that concealed the twist in the road ahead. "Shit, could be a patrol or something. Everyone off the road and out of sight, now," Red Dog commanded as he moved towards the forest that ran along the road. The rest of the bandits rushed after him, and they were soon all concealed along the tree line. "I don't hear anything. How do we know the hobgoblin isn't making this up?" someone asked from where he was crouched behind a bush. To Blacknail's surprise, it was Red Dog who answered. "Because I'm smarter than you." "Now shut up," Red Dog hissed at the first speaker. Almost immediately after that, the sound of hooves reached the humans' ears. The bandits were all crouched in bushes or leaning against trees, but as soon as they heard the noise they all turned to look out at the road. They didn't have to wait long for the horsemen themselves to appear. They rode into view at a quick canter. There were slightly fewer of them than there were bandits, but every one of them was mounted and armored. The soldiers, and that's what they had to be, were even more heavily armed and shinier than Persis guards had been. On top of their padded clothing they wore long chainmail shirts. Their legs were protected by steel greaves, and their lower arms by banded bracers. Their heads were protected by steel helmets that hid everything but their eyes and mouths, which could be seen though a large Y-shaped hole in the front of the helmets. Black Nail was glad he was no longer out on the road. He could imagine the horsemen simply riding right over him and the other bandits. Most of them would have been trampled to death without much of a fight. It was just another reason why Black Nail really hated horses. Most of the riders not only had swords at their waists but held long spears as well. One of the riders out front had a large blue piece of cloth tied to the end of his spear. It waved and snapped loudly in the wind behind him as he rode, showing flashes of a golden stag's head insignia. As Black Nail watched the soldiers pass, he had to admit that they looked dangerous. The humans in his tribe never looked quite so impressive. When the riders were out of sight down the road, Red Dog spoke. "That's Lord Strakan's banner. What are that many of his armsmen doing out here? His land is further south, and he can't have a lot of men to throw around these days," he mused aloud. "Could be anything. I don't know about you, but I've been out of touch with noble politics lately," Cedar answered. Red Dog grunted in agreement, before ordering everyone back onto the road. Then they were on their way again. As the hours went by, many of the bandits began to tire out, including Black Nail. The hobgoblin had never walked so far before. His feet really ached, and his boots were rubbing his skin raw. He had tried removing the boots, but Cedar had stopped him, and told him that it would only make things worse. Black Nail wasn't sure if he believed his master, but did as he was told. Eventually, Red Dog stopped the party with an upraised hand. Black Nail looked around and listened carefully, but he didn't detect anything out of the ordinary. It just seemed like any other spot on the forest-enclosed road to him. "We'll stop here for the night, and start tracking our targets in the morning. We're too close to them to be using the road anymore. If they have the sense the gods gave goblins, then they'll have someone watching the road," Red Dog explained. Black Nail gave Red Dog an annoyed glare at the obviously intentional insult, but most the other members of the group just seemed glad to be able to finally stop walking. Black Nail empathized with them. He couldn't wait to get off his feet either. The bandits split up for a few minutes to find a good place to set up for the night. Soon a spot was chosen. It was a small cluster of grey boulders large enough to shield them from sight and to be somewhat defensible. There were 9 stones and each of them was taller than a human. Together they were arranged in a loose circle. No trees grew within a few dozen feet of the stones, and the ground around them was hard with only a sparse covering of plants. Black Nail thought it was beautiful. The hobgoblin walked up and ran his hand along the surface of the closest stone. It was smooth to the touch and warmer than he thought it would be. The sun must have heated it. From this close, Black Nail could almost make out faded patterns on the rocks, like someone had carved pictures into them once upon a time. However, if the stones had once borne images or words of some sort, the wind and rain had long since worn them away. Cedar noticed Black Nail examining the stones, and walked up behind him. "These stone were put here. They're too old for men, and they're not the floor carve style. They don't work stone. That means this circle was put here by goblins. Maybe, even ancestors of yours," Cedar told the hobgoblin. Black Nail removed his hand from the stone. The idea that this special place had been made by goblins felt right. The stones, and the way they were arranged, spoke to him. It had meaning, even if Black Nail couldn't tell what the meaning was supposed to be. He looked up into the clear blue sky above him. The thought that goblins had created something that had lasted so very long resonated with the hobgoblin. The idea of making things such as this had never even occurred to him before now. He turned to his master. "Thank you, master," he told him. Cedar eyed him curiously and a corner of his mouth rose to form a smirk. "For what?" he asked. "Everything," Black Nail replied. He turned back to the stone and touched it again. Red Dog stomped over and interrupted them. He looked annoyed and was scowling. "Great, so not only do we have to sleep beside a bloody hobgoblin, but we're also setting up camp in some sort of creepy goblin shrine thing," he remarked. "You're the boss. We could try to find a different spot if you want, but this one seems better than most. That is of course unless on top of your fear of hobgoblins you're also afraid of ghosts." Cedar joked. "It sure doesn't sound like I'm the boss," Red Dog grumbled as he walked past them and began helping set up. It didn't take them a lot of time to set up for the night. They had been traveling light. Beyond the basic gear and weapons, all they had brought was blankets and a large tarp in case it rained. Red Dog didn't allow anyone to light a fire until it got dark. He wanted there to be no chance of them being detected, and a fire during the day would be too much of a risk. The smoke would be visible for miles. As night began to fall, Black Nail could smell some of the new recruits grow nervous. For many of them it was their first time out in the woods at night in such a small group. The fact that they didn't have a fire, but did have bad human night vision, probably didn't help either. When the night sky had blackened enough to completely mask any smoke, Red Dog finally lit a fire in the center of the boulders. He kept it small enough that it was unlikely anyone would see it through the trees. The fire helped a little, but a lot of the men still seemed nervous. Black Nail didn't blame them. He didn't like camping out in the forest much either. The shadowy forest and reaching tree branches could have been concealing any number of threats, and unlike most of the men here, he knew exactly what to be afraid of. As a hobgoblin he might be larger than before, but most of the hungry beasts that lived in the woods would barely notice the difference. He would simply be a slightly more filling snack. Between the aura of fear and the heavy watch, Red Dog insisted on very few people got a good sleep that night. Many of the bandits slept fretfully and were awake much of the night. Black Nail himself slept more than he had planned to. He found the presence of the ancient stones that encircled their camp soothing for some reason, and so he slept peacefully. Eventually the long night ended and dusk broke. The few people who were sleeping were awakened, and the group packed up and headed out to complete their mission. They followed the road, but stuck to the edges of the bush so that anyone watching would have a hard time seeing them. The party was split in two, with one group on each side of the road, so they wouldn't miss anything. Cedar led one group, and Red Dog the other. Moving through the thick underbrush of the forest slowed them down quite a bit, but they had much less distance to travel today. At first nothing stood out as they made their way along the road. "What's that?" one of the new recruits asked, as he pointed to a spot beside the road. Everyone immediately looked in the direction he indicated, including Black Nail. "Looks like a trashed wagon." "Let's check it out," another bandit replied after a second. "Wait a second. First we'll search the area to see if anyone is watching," Cedar told them. At Cedar's command they continued on past the wagon through the woods. When they didn't find anyone or anything, Cedar stepped out onto the road and looked around. "I don't see any good vantage points nearby, so we should be unobserved," he told them. He ordered several men to cross the road and fetch Red Dog while he and the others headed back to check out the wagon. They walked down the road until they got to the wooden wreck. It was concealed from the road by a small overgrown hill, which they had to go around. When they got to the wagon, Black Nail immediately smelled blood, human blood. The wagon itself was badly damaged, and nothing but a pile of broken wood that had been stripped of everything useful. Red Dog and his group arrived and joined them around the wreck. "Well, this was sure a waste of time," one of the bandits commented. "No, it wasn't. I'm willing to bet this is the work of our highwayman. This looks like a farmer or small merchant's wagon. That would be an inviting target for them." Cedar replied. "How does that help us?" someone asked. "We know they were here not too long ago, so now we just need to track them back to their lair," Cedar explained as he examined the wagon and the ground around it. After a minute he straightened up and turned to Black Nail. "Do you have a scent?" he asked the hobgoblin. "Yes, one of them bleeds," Black Nail replied. He smiled eagerly as the scent of blood and his master's attention excited him. "That makes this almost too easy," Cedar said as he smiled back. "Bloody creepy is what it is," someone muttered. "Just be glad he's on our side," someone else whispered softly, but not so softly that Black Nail couldn't hear them. The hobgoblin's smile widened in response. That was what he wanted the humans to think, that they were better off with him on their side. "So you can track them?" Red Dog asked. Cedar huffed indignantly before responding. "I can track practically anyone or anything. They left plenty of signs, and with Black Nail's nose this will be as easy as falling off a log," he answered. "Good, then you and your pet can lead the way," Red Dog told him. Black Nail hissed softly in anger at the disrespect he heard in the man's voice, but he suppressed the sudden flare of rage and didn't act on it further. This didn't stop the two men closest to him from backing away a few steps though. Red Dog though was apparently unconcerned and ignored the hobgoblin, but Cedar gave Black Nail a disapproving look. "Let's get going," Red Dog told everyone. Cedar led them across the road and into the forest once again. The rest of the bandits followed him and Black Nail. As they moved, Cedar pointed out signs to the hobgoblin, like broken twigs and a partial boot prints. Black Nail found it interesting but almost unnecessary since he could simply follow their prey's scent. Cedar had to stop and look around for tracks every once in a while, but Black Nail never lost the trail. His master seemed to want to track the highwayman himself, because he only asked for Black Nail's help once. The iron-like scent of blood began to grow stronger as they walked deeper into the woods, until Black Nail started to become concerned. "More blood," he whispered to Cedar. His master frowned in concern as well, but they continued moving forward. They soon found the source of the smell. Up ahead, laying on the forest floor, was a human corpse, and it had been shredded. It took a few seconds to identify it as the remains of a man. It was little more than a pile of bloody flesh and broken bones. "Shit. This wasn't done by no man," one of the bandits said as he went white and began to panic. Behind Black Nail, Red Dog calmly drew his sword, and leveled it at the panicked speaker's throat. "If you can't keep your shit together, then just shut up and stay fucking still, or you'll regret it," he told the startled man. Then he turned to Cedar, who had crouched down to examine the body. "What are we dealing with?" he asked grimly. "Hopefully nothing, because it filled its stomach and left." "This mess is definitely the work of a troll though," Cedar answered. "Damnation," Red Dog swore. "I fucking hate trolls. Every time I run into one, someone dies." Written in blood 5. "Could be worse, it could have been a drake," Cedar replied. "Trolls are smaller and will rarely attack a group of armed men this big, especially if they've just eaten. As long as we don't trip over the damned thing, we should be fine." This one must have followed the same blood trail as Black Nail and picked the bleeder off. Several of the bandits looked more than a little afraid. Several of them were throwing nervous glances at the woods around them. "What's a troll?" "I mean, I've heard of them, but I never actually expected to see one, or have one see me," one of the new recruits asked. Cedar gave the man a disdainful look, but answered him. "Trolls have twin fangs the size of long knives and thick skin that doesn't bleed unless you pretty much decapitate them. Except for that, they're basically what you would get if you took a goblin and made it twice the size of a man and 100 times as angry," he explained. "Bloody lovely," one of the other bandits muttered sarcastically. Cedar then got up and examined the ground all around the corpse. He called Black Nail over and showed the hobgoblin various signs within the disturbed area. The hobgoblin found this much more interesting than his earlier tracking lessons. His sense of smell didn't help him nearly as much. "It looks like there were 3 men here. The troll came down on them fast. It killed the wounded one and his friends made a run for it. It doesn't look like the troll followed them, instead it ate its fill and then headed off back into the woods," Cedar told Red Dog. The man looked thoughtful as he considered their options. "We should be good to just follow them back to their camp then. Will they still be on alert?" Red Dog asked Cedar. Hard to say. I'm guessing the troll attack happened last night, which is enough time that I would feel safe. I doubt these guys are used to the forest though, so I'd bet they didn't get much sleep last night, Cedar answered. And we did. Black Nail heard someone mutter behind him. We'll go carefully then, and when we find the camp we'll circle around. They'll undoubtedly be watching the direct way, for trolls if nothing else, Red Dog told them. Cedar nodded in agreement. I'll take Black Nail and scout the path ahead then. We'll take out or mark any sentries so then you and the others can approach unseen, Cedar suggested. Sounds good, Red Dog replied. Come Black Nail. It's time for me to teach you the more violent parts of the ranger's trade. I have a feeling you'll pick it up quick, Cedar told the hobgoblin, as he shrugged off his backpack and handed it to another bandit. Black Nail chuckled and licked his lips. This sounded like it would be so much fun. He could think of nothing he would rather do than stalk unsuspecting prey through the woods with the scent of blood in the air. His heart pounded in excitement just thinking about it. Thank you so much, Master, he replied excitedly as a wicked grin stretched across his face. Cedar slipped through the trees so quietly that even Black Nail had difficulty hearing him. He followed in his master's wake and tried to be just as silent. To his own ears he wasn't quite successful, but with his boots removed he moved quietly enough that Cedar didn't complain. The hobgoblin instinctively knew how to balance himself, and where to place his bare feet to avoid breaking twigs and other obstacles. After so long walking in boots the cool earth and wet grass felt soothing beneath his feet as he walked. The thrill of the hunt he was feeling was more than worth the long walk it had taken to get here. The canopy overhead was thin enough that lots of light got through. The abundance of sunshine meant the forest around him was thick with green-leaved bushes. This gave them plenty of cover and helped them conceal themselves. The area was also rockier than where Herad had made her camp. Every once in a while they would stumble upon a large exposed boulder that rose from the earth, like the ones they had sheltered among last night. Ahead of him Cedar moved out from behind a tree to peer at a trampled plant. Having confirmed that he was still on the right track, the scout got up and started moving again. He stalked through the bush while moving from cover to cover and checking for signs of their targets. Black Nail observed and tried to copy his master's movements. He was very impressed by how quietly Cedar could move and how he could track without using his nose. The hobgoblin watched his master examine the surrounding forest while crouched behind a bush. After a minute Cedar raised a hand and signaled Black Nail. Before they had headed out to track down the deserters Cedar had made him memorize several different hand signals. Black Nail had instantly realized how useful they would be for communicating without making any noise. His master was a genius for coming up with such a great idea. Black Nail was sure nothing like it would ever have occurred to him. The signal his master was currently sending meant that he should get to cover because someone might be around. Black Nail felt a flash of excitement at the thought of finally cornering their quarry. He felt his mouth moisten with saliva in anticipation, but he obeyed his master and remained where he was. Slowly and carefully as not to attract attention the hobgoblin bent down and took cover at the base of the tree beside him. However, he couldn't resist the urge to peek out and look for whatever Cedar had seen. Black Nail eagerly scanned the forest for signs, but was disappointed when he didn't see anything or anyone among the leafy branches or rough-barked tree trunks around him. He wanted to hunt. His teeth ached, and his tongue flicked out and over his teeth to clean them in preparation. He shivered as he felt a seductive feeling similar to rage start to burn within him. It filled him with a hunger for action and blood. Black Nail had to close his eyes and focus on mentally picturing sword exercises to suppress the urges. He knew discipline would make him stronger than rage or hunger ever could. A few seconds later after Black Nail had managed to get his urges under control he opened his eyes to see Cedar flashing more signals his way. The first signal told Black Nail to look over to his left, and the next meant he wanted Black Nail to wait and watch. With a regretful sigh the hobgoblin resigned himself to spending the next little while waiting, and not hunting. As Cedar stealthily got up and began moving Black Nail looked over in the direction his master had indicated. He still didn't see anything. Cedar stopped beside a large smooth tree trunk and signaled Black Nail again. He wanted the hobgoblin to carefully circle the target from the opposite direction. Black Nail smiled as he got up and obeyed. Finally, a chance to act. Excitedly he crept forward while looking for his prey. Then as he was moving over to a large jagged rock he saw movement out of the corner of his eye up on a nearby hill. Instantly the cloaked hobgoblin went totally still, and his eyes focused on that spot. As he watched Black Nail noticed something brown and human-sized move ever so slightly. It was mostly hidden behind a tree, so he couldn't get a good look at it. He slipped around the boulder to get a better view. It was a man. He was scanning the forest from his high viewpoint while leaning against a tree. He had a large brown cloak on but under that was wearing a bright blue shirt and black pants. The clothes confused Black Nail. He couldn't think of a good reason for wearing the blue shirt that would be anything but a stupid idea. Did the man want to be seen? Was it some sort of trap? Black Nail threw a look back at his master. Cedar noticed the glance and quickly raised 2 fingers in another sign. 2 fingers meant that there was another man nearby. Black Nail hastily flashed the where sign back. His master pointed up to another spot on the hill, and then gestured to himself to show ownership. He then pointed to the man Black Nail could see and then back to the hobgoblin. Black Nail grinned happily and licked his lips. His master was going to take one of the men, and he wanted Black Nail to take the other. What a wonderful present his master had just given him. The hobgoblin watched the sentry on the hill until the man looked away. Then unseen, Black Nail slipped out from behind the rock, and crept forward along a path up the hill that was mostly concealed from the man's view. He was practically purring with joy. Soon the hobgoblin got close enough that he could smell the human, and he shivered in anticipation. He circled around the hill and began to climb it from the side. This was going to be so much fun. As he climbed, Black Nail's ears detected sounds that were out of place in the forest. He paused in his advance to listen. It sounded like several humans talking and moving, which meant the human camp wasn't too far away. He examined the forest in that direction but didn't see anything that would mean anyone in the camp was close enough to see him. Reassured, the hobgoblin began to creep across the final stretch of bush between him and the human scout. His target was an average-sized man with black hair. He was still leaning against the tree while lazily scanning the forest below him for threats. However, Black Nail had already snuck right under the man's nose and was now safely behind him out of sight. The sentry would never see the hobgoblin coming, which was just how Black Nail liked it. "See anything yet, Kratz?" the man suddenly yelled. Black Nail dropped to the ground in alarm. "Ha, I would have said something if I did," come an answering shout from out of sight. "Yay, but the boss wanted us to check in with each other every once in a while. I guess you're still alive since you're still talking and all," the first man replied in jest. The only answer the other man gave was a brief chuckle. Black Nail rose a bit and tried to find the second speaker, but much to his frustration couldn't see him. Then there was the sound of a scuffle and a brief gasp. Black Nail's target looked over and frowned with concern. "You okay, Kratz? I thought I heard something," the man shouted. The only sound from where the other man had been was a distinct cheery bird call. The sentry's frown deepened as his concern turned to suspicion. He took a step towards the camp and opened his mouth as if to shout. Black Nail had already launched himself forward at the man. The bird call had been a signal. Black Nail was sure it meant Cedar had just taken out the second sentry, and that meant Black Nail needed to act. The hobgoblin covered the ground lightning fast. His long muscular body carried his light frame forward with startling speed. The wind whipped his cloak behind him as he shot forward from the bushes. Before the man could even turn or start yelling, Black Nail was upon him. The hobgoblin hit the unprepared man with a flying tackle that ended with his arms wrapped around his opponent's waist. Surprise and momentum allowed the lighter hobgoblin to knock the man off balance. It also knocked the air from his opponent's lung, and prevented him from yelling out a warning. They careened off to the side together. As they fell, the sentry flailed uselessly. Meanwhile, Black Nail used his hold on the man's waist to pull himself up, and then twist one of his legs so he could hook it under the man's knee. Using the leverage this gave him, Black Nail flipped himself around so that he was now clinging to the man's back. They hit the ground with a loud thud. The man landed face first with the weight of the hobgoblin on his back. The breath was knocked out of the sentry for a second time by the impact, and all he could do was wheeze in pain. The prone sentry tried to draw in a breath to yell, or maybe to scream, but Black Nail grabbed his hair and yanked the man's head up. This caused the man to croak in pain, and allowed Black Nail to wrap his other claw around the man's neck. The sentry went very still as he felt the hobgoblin's sharp nails dig into the flesh around his throat. He whimpered in fright, and Black Nail smiled in satisfaction. He then adjusted his weight so he could lean forward into the man's line of sight. The man must have suspected something was strange about his assailant, but when he got a close look at Black Nail's face, his eyes widened and he went white as snow. "Be very quiet," Black Nail half whispered and half growled to him. The man's head bobbed up and down. At first Black Nail thought the sentry was trying to nod, but then his eyes rolled up into his head until only the whites were visible and he went as limp as a dead fish. Black Nail released his grip on the man's throat and slapped him across the face. The blow made a loud smacking noise and left a red handprint on the man's face, but otherwise the sentry didn't react. Black Nail hissed in disappointment. He had wanted to have more fun. He got to his feet and stared with dissatisfaction down at the unconscious sentry. Black Nail heard someone approach and turned to see Cedar push his way out from the bushes. Cedar frowned as he saw the corpse-white and unmoving man at Black Nail's feet. "I thought I told you to try and capture them alive," Cedar told him with obvious disappointment. "He's not dead, just stupid." "Stupid SS man went to sleep, so he's no fun," Black Nail hissed in annoyance. "I see," Cedar replied in a confused tone that meant he didn't really understand at all. He walked over to the unconscious man and kicked him a few times, but seemed satisfied when the man flinched and moaned ever so slightly. "Praise camp is that way," Black Nail impatiently told his master as he raised a finger to point towards the source of the noise he had heard earlier. The hobgoblin wanted to continue the hunt. There were still more humans to catch, and he had never had so much fun before. He was lightheaded with giddiness and anticipation, even if he was also a little disappointed he couldn't eat any of the prey he caught. After throwing a look in the direction Black Nail had indicated, Cedar addressed the hobgoblin. "Good to know, but that's not our job right now. Grab that fellow and hide him in the bushes along with the one I knocked out. Then sit on them until I get back with Red Dog. You don't actually have to sit on them, just guard them," Cedar told Black Nail. "Yes, master," Black Nail acknowledged with a disappointed sigh. Why couldn't his master just ever let him have fun? The humans were so close. He wanted to at least stalk them a little. No one would ever even know. Cedar turned away, and walked back through the trees towards where Red Dog was waiting for them. When he was gone, the hobgoblin grabbed the man at his feet and started dragging him into the bushes. He easily found the man Cedar had knocked out by smell, and dumped the other sentry on top of him. He was almost disappointed that Cedar didn't actually want him to sit on them. Piled up as they were, the unconscious men actually looked sort of comfy, and Black Nail liked the idea of resting atop the bodies of his defeated prey. Black Nail's mind began to wander as he waited for Cedar to return. He was getting kind of hungry. He wasn't allowed to eat the humans, but maybe he could lick them. Or maybe he could maim a few and eat the bits that came loose. They would survive that, probably. After thinking it over for a while, Black Nail decided to simply take some jerky out of his pouch and eat that instead. He was in the middle of chewing it when he heard someone yell in his direction. Krats. Tyrael. I've got your supper, the voice shouted in Black Nail's direction. Black Nail calmly swallowed the last of the jerky and tried to come up with a plan. Obviously this human was calling for the other two who had been knocked out. If he didn't get an answer then he would probably raise the alarm, which would be bad. Should he try and mimic a human and reply himself? No, that wouldn't work. He didn't have a very human-sounding voice. Human voices were all deep and dumb-sounding. Black Nail started licking his fingers clean. Should he wake a human up and force them to answer? No, not enough time. Black Nail's eyes swept over the unconscious men he was supposed to be guarding, and lingered on the smaller man's cloak and gloves. He grinned gleefully as an idea occurred to him. Guys, you there, the voice called again. The speaker sounded a little nervous now. He stopped walking and glanced warily at the bush in front of him for signs of his friends. He was balancing 2 plates of steaming hot food in his hands. The human's nervousness disappeared however when a small man he recognized stepped out from behind a tree. His hood was up for some reason but the man recognized the sentry's cloak. He smiled as he realized his friend was in the middle of a fit of coughing, which was probably why he hadn't answered him earlier. The sentry did however wave cheerfully as he strode forward, before then extending a gloved hand to take a plate of food. Behind you, the sentry said between coughs, as he raised his other hand to point behind the man. His voice was unusually raspy, probably from the coughing. What is it? The deserter asked as he turned to look. That was when Black Nail, who was dressed in the sentry's clothes, jumped up and smashed him in the back of the head with a wooden plate. While the man groaned as he staggered. Black Nail hit him again, and kept hitting him until he went down. Then the hobgoblin flipped his hood back to reveal his green grinning face, and began to drag the third man into the bushes to join the others. This was just too much fun. Written in blood 6. Black Nail was quite happy with himself. Not only had he tricked the stupid human, but he had managed to get some free food out of it as well. After hiding the body Black Nail walked back and picked up all the food that had been dropped onto the ground in the earlier scuffle. The hobgoblin spent the next few minutes watching the forest below from the top of the hill, and eating the red meat and hard bread that he had picked up earlier. From his vantage point at the sentry's post he saw Cedar and the other bandits arrive and begin to climb the hill below him. You changed your clothes? Cedar asked Black Nail curiously when he reached the top and saw him. The other bandits were right behind the scout. One of them gave Black Nail a horrified glance. Forget about that. What in all the hells is he eating? The other bandit asked in alarm when he saw Black Nail. The hobgoblin sniggered at the man's concern. He was sitting on the piled bodies of the unconscious men, while casually chewing a piece of meat. He'd tried finding something else, like a log, to sit on but hadn't ended up finding anything. Besides, this was actually very comfy. It smells, and looks, like boiled beef, someone else answered condescendingly to the other man. The first speaker flushed slightly. Black Nail ignored the other bandits and focused on Cedar. As amusing as they were, only his master was important. I had to be sneaky, Black Nail explained to Cedar, as he pointed to the third unconscious man. Hey, well I guess it worked, Cedar replied. He looked like he wanted to ask some more questions, but instead he turned to Red Dog. We should get going. They'll soon notice these men are missing, Cedar told him. Red Dog nodded, then turned to Black Nail and gave him a disapproving look. Are those men still alive? He asked the hobgoblin. Probably, Black Nail replied as he shrugged. Red Dog appeared unsatisfied by Black Nail's answer, but he scowled and turned back to Cedar. Fine, let's go. The hobgoblin stays here and guards these men, though, he said. I have no problem with that, Cedar replied without concern. Red Dog began giving orders to the other bandits. He got them organized and told them the plan of attack. Black Nail listened and was sort of disappointed that he wouldn't be joining in the rest of the fun. Red Dog's plan did seem like it might involve a lot of face-to-face fighting though, and Black Nail was fine with missing out on that. He much preferred attacking people from behind. It was safer. Besides, Black Nail knew he wasn't a very good swordsman yet. He much preferred the sneaky type of fighting. So, he had no problem with staying there while continuing to eat his food and sit on his trophies. Maybe one of them would even wake up, and then Black Nail could have some more fun. The bandits finished their planning and drew their weapons. Most of them had swords, but others had bows or more exotic things like hand axes. Red Dog led the way and the group headed towards the deserters' camp. With their dirty unshaven faces and their worn-down and mismatched leather armor the bandits looked savage and dangerous. They didn't however display the discipline and competence of the horsemen from earlier or even precise guards. Black Nail watched them go, and decided he wasn't going to listen to Red Dog after all. When the other bandits were out of sight the hobgoblin got up and followed them. He wanted to see what happened next. Cedar led Red Dog and the rest of their group of outlaws through the woods towards their target. They moved slowly in order to sneak up on the group of deserters who had set up camp ahead. The thick trees and hilly terrain concealed their approach. It didn't take long for Cedar's group to get within sight of the deserters' camp. The old scout stopped at the edge of the forest where it ended in a cliff. He crouched low to the ground to help conceal himself and looked down. Below them and down a rocky incline lay a small recessed valley. The sound of rushing water could be heard from a small waterfall that rushed down the steep rocky cliff that lay across the valley. The creek it fed then wandered along one side of the valley and marked its boundary. The thick forest and sharp hills continued on the other side of the stream. A bunch of uniform blue tents had been set up within the gorge. Under an overhang on one section of the cliff the deserters had also constructed a large crude wooden structure. Cedar and Red Dog could see a number of men moving about or lounging around the area. In the center of the tent someone was cooking on a large fire. Well, those are definitely standard Elorian infantry tents. That means these are our deserters, Red Dog whispered. It could be an entirely different group of deserters who just happened to be highwaymen as well, one of the new recruits whispered back. Red Dog was not amused by the comment, and it showed on his face. One of the other bandits took this as permission to cuff the speaker. The man took the blow and shut up. Look at the tents and that shelter over there. There are more of them than we thought, Cedar told Red Dog. How many do you think there are, exactly? Red Dog asked him. At least as many as us, even without counting the scouts we took out on the way in, Cedar answered. Then I guess we'll just have to go back, and ask Harad for some reinforcements, Red Dog muttered sarcastically, as he scowled down at the camp below them. No one laughed. You're in charge, Cedar remarked indifferently. Red Dog gave him a dirty look. The bandit lieutenant clearly didn't like any of the options available to him. We have the advantage of surprise, he mused. Until we lose it, Cedar added. If you have nothing constructive to add, then shut up. Red Dog hissed back. Cedar didn't bother to respond, or even turn around. He kept looking over the cliff and at the deserters' camp. Fine, here's what we'll do. We'll go down the hill that way, and then sneak around to those tents over there. They're close to the edge of the woods, and there are quite a few men lounging about around them. We'll rush out and capture them before they know what is happening. That'll give us the advantage in numbers, and some prisoners to bargain with, Red Dog told them as gestured to various spots below them. With odds this close I've always preferred less direct attacks. We could scout around a bit more, Cedar recommended. That could take hours. They could stumble onto our trail, or notice they're missing sentries at any time. No, we have to go in now, Red Dog replied. Fine, I'll stay here as a lookout. That way I can guard the rear, and cover you with my bow, Cedar suggested. Red Dog appeared to think it over for a few seconds. No, you can cover us better from further down the hill and closer to the action. Besides, you just unpacked that sword of yours, so let's give you an opportunity to use it, Red Dog told him with a smirk. Cedar didn't look happy with the other bandits' decision, but when Red Dog led the rest of the outlaws down the slope he followed them. Red Dog slowly and carefully led his group of 24 bandits down the slope and through the woods around the camp. The slope was rocky and cover was limited to the occasional large rock or bush so they had to move carefully, but they made it safely to the bottom and back into the forest without being seen. As they moved through the trees there were several times when a new recruit messed up or slipped and accidentally made a loud noise. When that happened everyone froze and listened nervously for any reaction from the men ahead of them. When no one noticed them they continued on. Once they were only a few dozen feet from the tents, and the deserters around them, they stopped to observe their targets for a minute. There were 8 enemies seated or standing around their target. Only a few of them had any weapons on them, and none of them were in their hands. An about equal number of other men were visible in more distant areas of the camp. Silently, Red Dog signaled his men forward. Ever so slowly they crawled through the last stretch of thick brush and towards the back of the tents that sat at edge of the woods. Cedar was with them, but was lagging behind and holding up the rear. When Red Dog reached the edge of the forest he burst out, and into a run. The large man raced around the tents and announced himself by punching out the closest deserter. There was a loud crack as his fist impacted the other man's chin. As the now unconscious deserter fell to the ground, his startled companions sprung to their feet. The rest of Red Dog's rugged outlaws were right behind him. They crashed into the unsuspecting opponents ahead of them with. Cedar remained at the edge of the woods and drew his bow. In front of the tents a melee had started, even if it was a very one-sided one. Red Dog's men not only outnumbered their opponents, but the enemy was also mostly unarmed. Red Dog himself managed to lay another deserter low with a second solid punch before even having to draw his blade. It didn't take long for the rest of the deserters to realize something was happening. Their camp came alive like an anthill that had just been kicked. Shouts of panic and alarm filled the air as they tried to figure out what was going on. The closest group of deserters began falling one after another. Some of the bandits used clubs, or were just strong enough, to disable their opponents with painful blunt strikes. Others simply surrendered when swords and daggers were shoved in their faces, and they were then forced to the ground. Those that tried to run or draw their own blades were put down hard, usually in a bloody and fatal manner. As they were cut down brief screams of pain joined the panicked yelling that filled the camp. Only one man managed to flee across the camp to regroup with his fellows. By this time, the deserters in the rest of the camp were beginning to get organized. One man emerged from a tent across the camp with a bow, and promptly shot an arrow at Red Dog. The bandit lieutenant didn't see it coming, he was busy watching over his men. Fortunately for him the shot missed and ripped through the tent behind him. The noise alerted Red Dog to the threat and he spun to find the shooter. Before the archer could try for another shot one of Cedar's arrows took him in the chest. Red Dog gave Cedar a brief nod of thanks. An organized group of defenders began to appear, across the camp. A large group of deserters had banded together and armed themselves, but were holding back for now. Cedar sent a few arrows their way to distract them. The deserters scattered and took cover among the nearby tents, rocks, and equipment. Shouting could be heard as someone attempted to get the former soldiers organized and come up with a plan. Their plan became obvious when reinforcements arrived carrying round wooden shields, and the rest of the deserters formed up behind them. Cedar took a few more shots at the men behind the shields, but they intercepted everyone. With an annoyed grunt Cedar stopped shooting to preserve arrows, and the fighting ground to a halt. On one side of the camp were Red Dog and the rough-looking bandits. They numbered 2 dozen, but were busy regrouping and securing their captives. Almost a dozen men lay on the ground at their feet. On the other side a dozen armed and organized deserters were glaring at their attackers, but weren't moving to engage them. Most of them still wore their blue military uniforms. Every once in a while they would be reinforced by a straggler or two. Well, that's inconvenient. Who would have thought they would have carried those heavy things all the way here? No one in the band bothers with shields, Red Dog remarked as he examined their next group of opponents. Bah, who cares? A few shields isn't going to help them, one of the bandits said. True, we have them outnumbered now. So, let's see if they want to negotiate, Red Dog announced. However, before he could do anything though the situation changed. What the fuck is all this now? A deep booming voice suddenly yelled. The group of deserters grew agitated and then split apart, to let a large man walk to the front of them. He towered over the nearby men, and was heavily muscled. Even from a distance it was obvious he was bigger and more muscled than even Vorsha. He had a huge two-handed sword over his shoulder, and wore a chainmail shirt on his chest. As the bandits watched he pulled a metal helmet over his head. A few more deserters arrived alongside him, which meant the bandits only had a slight advantage in numbers now. Well, balls, Red Dog swore as he eyed this new opponent. He didn't seem happy. Our superior numbers won't mean much if we have to worry about prisoners, Cedar remarked. I don't suppose you could just shoot him? Red Dog asked. They both knew who he meant. With that armor and those nearby shields it's not bloody likely, Cedar replied. Damn, that would have made this a lot easier, Red Dog muttered half-heartedly. Their discussion was interrupted by a loud yell from the deserter leader. Instantly both sides went still. The air was thick with tension. Who in all the hells are you lot? He roared. Cedar gave Red Dog a look that clearly indicated that it was up to him to answer, and that he had better make it good. We're bandits in service to Harad the Black Snake. You've been poaching in her territory so she sent us to put a stop to it, Red Dog yelled back. What, she was too afraid to come herself, the giant asked arrogantly. More like you aren't worth her time. Why would she bother herself with a few deserters? She runs this entire territory, and has hundreds of men under her command, Red Dog replied. Cedar gave a quiet snort of amusement at the exaggeration. Red Dog ignored him. So then why did she send so few of her men to kill us, was the unconvinced reply. We're not here just to kill you. We're also here to offer you a chance to join us. You'd be stupid not to take it, Red Dog told them. Why in all the hells would we want to join up with a bitch like the Black Snake, the man laughed. So, that you don't all die. You may think you're tough ex-army shit, but so are half the outlaws in the north. We saw what was left of one of your men when that troll got through with him. You've no idea how to survive in the north. Even if we don't kill you, something else will soon enough, Red Dog argued. Ha, if that troll comes back I'll kill it myself. We don't need you, or your bitch. I'll kill her soon enough anyway, and then this territory will be mine. I'll give you one chance to save yourselves. Join me, the man bragged as he pulled a vial from a pouch and held it up for them to see. Fuck me, he's a slosher, Red Dog moaned. As a ripple of fear spread through Harad's minions another man stepped forward from among the deserters. He was a plain-looking man whose chin was covered in stubble and whose brown hair was unkempt. The only reason he stood out was that he was holding a long staff that ended in a clawed orb. A combat mage too. They have a thrice-damned combat mage. I strongly suggest we run now, Cedar told Red Dog. We don't know what crystals he has, and what magic he can do. Red Dog replied. Does it matter? I doubt he would be lugging that staff around if all it could do was light his way to the privy, Cedar responded harshly. If we run that slosher will chase us down quickly enough, Red Dog reasoned. If he hasn't taken any elixir yet, then he won't unless he has to. He must know how hard that stuff is to get out here, Cedar guessed. I suppose you can't just shoot the mage either. Red Dog asked darkly. Even if I could, who's going to fight that huge armored slosher? You, was Cedar's sarcastic reply. Red Dog sighed. He seemed to deflate as he slouched in despair. You know what really bothers me about all this? That the bloody goblin of yours is the only one who's going to survive this, he muttered darkly. Give me your answer, or I'll cut you to pieces, the giant roared impatiently before Cedar could reply. We're discussing your offer. Give us a second, Red Dog yelled back with an annoyed tone. Don't piss him off. Cedar hissed. Or what, he'll kill us. Red Dog hissed back. Black Nail watched Cedar and Red Dog continue to argue from atop the hill that looked down on the camp. It definitely seemed like his master was in a trouble. Things had been going well until that big male human had arrived. For some reason everyone was afraid of him. Well, he did have a very impressive sword and a shiny hat. The men behind Red Dog seemed on the edge of panic. Even his master looked out of sorts. Black Nail blamed the fat-faced man, Red Dog. His plan had obviously been stupid and had put Black Nail's master in danger. The hobgoblin really didn't want his master to get hurt or die, and it was looking increasingly likely that he would. He owed the man too much to let that happen. He also really didn't want to have to walk back to camp alone, and then try and explain everything that had happened to Harad. He doubted she would be very understanding, or that he would survive. What could he do though? The problem was the big man. So Black Nail had to do something about him, but what? He was definitely very big, and Black Nail was rather small. It would however be very satisfying to defeat such a man, to kill him. Black Nail shivered as the cruel hunger from before surged through him again. Feeling giddy and lightheaded, the hobgoblin smiled viciously in anticipation as he quickly considered various schemes. Yes, he would show these enemy humans why they should have never entered his territory. Having made up his mind, Black Nail launched himself down the hill, and scrambled through the woods. On all four limbs he navigated through the tangle of bushes and avoided the rocks at high speed. His light agile body allowed the hobgoblin to move in ways humans couldn't. Once he reached the edge of the woods that lay below the hill, the hobgoblin forced himself to a stop. That done, he quickly brushed himself off, and threw his hood up. Then with false calm he strolled out of the woods and into the deserters' camp. Immediately several of the deserters looked his way. Black Nail felt their gazes on him as he approached, and nervously noted that they were all armed and rather angry looking. He doubted he could fight a single one of the large humans off, let alone the whole group. Black Nail really hoped his plan was going to work. He probably should have spent a little more time thinking it through. It had seemed like such a good idea at the time though, when he had been far away and safe. If this plan failed, not only was he going to die painfully, but most likely so would his master. Up ahead, the large human leader raised his huge sword into the air and roared. "You cowardly dogs have had all the time I'm willing to give you. No more stalling. It's time to fight. When I cut you fuckers down, I'm going to make sure your deaths are slow and bloody." As a warning to others, he yelled with a voice full of rage and bloodlust. Written in blood 7. None of the deserters did more than glance briefly Black Nail's way as he walked up behind them. They were preoccupied by the bandits in front of them, and the hobgoblin was still wearing the cloak he had won from the sentry. Winning something from a fight was very different from stealing it. No one found anything odd about another straggler joining the group now, and that's exactly what Black Nail looked like. Most the deserters wore the same cloak as him, and he wasn't even the only one in the group with his hood up. The hobgoblin stretched himself as tall as possible and walked on his toes as he entered the crowd of deserters. He hoped his somewhat awkward gait wouldn't attract attention, but he was short for a human, so he had to do something. He avoided directly looking at anyone and tilted his head down so that his green skin was hidden within the shadows of his cloak. Black Nail saw his target. He was rather hard to miss actually. The man loomed over the other deserters like a solitary mountain over the forest. Quickly, but without seeming hurried, the hobgoblin walked up behind the large man. Luckily for him, the rest of the men had taken a few steps back from their leader and given him space. "You've had all the time you need. If you don't surrender right this second, I'm going to kill every last one of you," the enemy leader yelled. Black Nail muttered thoughtfully to himself. He wasn't sure what his next move was going to be. Things seemed more complicated now that he was actually in the middle of the enemy tribe. His target was definitely very big. Even from the back he towered over the hobgoblin. Black Nail would have trouble just reaching his throat, and that the shiny shirt protected his chest. The hobgoblin needed to adjust his plan, and quickly, or it wouldn't work. A tall man with a sword in his hand turned towards Black Nail and looked him over. He was standing only a few feet away. "Ha, I'll bet you 2 silver that those spineless dogs are going to surrender any second now." "No one sane would pick a fight with Baskus," the swordsman told Black Nail. The hobgoblin gave a vague grunt of acknowledgement and ignored the man. He still needed to come up with a better plan. The disguised hobgoblin perked up as an idea suddenly occurred to him. He sure hoped he could pull it off. Stupid red dog, his insane plan had put Black Nail's master in danger. Black Nail idly wondered how the man had survived so long without someone around to clean up his messes. The hobgoblin drew his dagger as he stood in the very middle of his tribe's enemies. He sighed in relief when his action failed to raise anyone's suspicion. Everyone around him was still focused on Red Dog's group. Then, with a vicious snarl, Black Nail pounced onto the back of the enemy tribe's leader. As everyone around him reacted in shock, Black Nail got a firm grip on the neck of Big Man's chain shirt and pulled himself up higher. "What the holy fucks," the giant yelled as he jumped in surprise. He dropped his sword and the vial he was holding, spun around, and reached back to try and grab the freaky thing that was climbing his back. Black Nail wasted no time. As the man flinched and tried to grab him, the hobgoblin reached around and cut the man's exposed throat. The dagger dug deep as Black Nail put as much force as possible into it. He wouldn't get a second chance at this. He felt warm blood wash over his hand, and the scent of wet iron filled the air. As the man choked and began to topple forward like a felled tree, Black Nail flipped himself over the man's shoulders. He landed on the ground, and rolled straight towards the bandits and safety. His hood slipped off as he moved. Black Nail didn't even notice, he was completely focused on sprinting like mad towards his master. He had a feeling there was about to be a whole bunch of very angry humans behind him. He cut through the wind and tore the dirt up behind him as he ran. He pushed himself faster and faster, and he didn't even think of stopping until he had hurtled past the bandits. He was going so fast he had to drop and roll wildly across the ground to reduce his momentum so he could stop. Once safe behind Red Dog and the others, he climbed back to his feet. As Black Nail brushed some of the dirt from the roll off of himself, he noticed that everyone was staring at him. The bandits had all turned away from their opponents and were looking at him. Their mouths were open and eyes were wide with shock. "What?" Black Nail asked. Then he threw a nervous glance behind himself, just in case. There was nothing there, but you could never be sure in this accursed forest. "Mesa means mercy. Where did you come from?" Red Dog exclaimed. Black Nail considered the question for a second. "From the sewers," he replied uncertainly. Cedar broke out laughing so loudly and joyfully that it echoed through the camp. "So much for the slosher," he cackled. "We still have to worry about that combat mage," Red Dog reminded him, but a big half-crazy smile was plastered across his face as he said it. Cedar gave the other man an even bigger grin, which almost didn't seem possible. His normally lined face looked practically cracked as he smiled uncharacteristically. Then Black Nail's master turned and faced the deserters. They were still recovering from the shock of seeing the hobgoblin murder their supposedly invincible leader right in front of them. Not a single one of them had even started after Black Nail. They were still staring wide-eyed at each other and the corpse on the ground in front of them. Surrender now, or we'll send more hobgoblins after you. Cedar yelled. No one answered for a few seconds. We surrender, as long as your offer to join Herat is still good, someone eventually called out. It was the staff-carrying mage that answered. He was still staring in shock at the corpse of the vessel. No one among the deserters challenged his decision. It is, Red Dog yelled back. I guess we won then, Cedar announced with satisfaction. Red Dog just blinked blankly at him. Good, Black Nail. I'm feeding you as much as you can eat when we get back. Cedar told the hobgoblin. And I'm buying you a beer, another bandit added. He had a faraway look in his eyes. A chorus of agreements and offers of treats flowed from the rest of the bandits. Black Nail smiled at them. Even Red Dog gave him an approving nod. I protect my band SS. It's what warriors do, the hobgoblin lied through his sharp pointy teeth. He had only really cared about saving Cedar, but he was more than happy to take the opportunity to suck up and make some new allies. It took a few seconds for everyone to remember that they were still in hostile territory and sober up. When they did, Red Dog straightened up and walked a few steps towards the defeated deserters. They were just standing there looking unsure of what to do, or even of what had just happened. Hey! You guys drop your weapons, and that goes double for the mage. You're now our captives until you officially join up with the Black Snake, he yelled at them. Black Nail walked up beside the bandit lieutenant, and gave him another toothy smile. I get the big one's shiny hat, he told Red Dog. Red Dog let him take the helmet. As Cedar and other bandits organized the aftermath of the fight, Black Nail wandered around the camp and explored. Since everyone else in his band was busy rounding up the deserters, he had the camp almost to himself. The clearing the deserters had made their home in was filled with the army equipment they had taken with them and the goods they had stolen. A very crude wooden shelter had been set up under the ledge of an overhanging cliff, and over a dozen similar small blue tents were scattered around. The far end of the camp was marked by a small muddy stream. As Black Nail wandered about, he tried on his new helmet. It didn't fit. It was far too large and it rattled as he walked. His large green nose also poked out and the helmet pinched it painfully. With a sad sigh, Black Nail packed it away for later and then continued riffling through the nearby tents and supplies. Everything he found that piqued his interest, like random pieces of clothes and shiny things, ended up shoved into his pouches or pack. Everything that smelled tasty ended up shoved into his mouth. As Black Nail was chewing a piece of cheese, which he had recently acquired a taste for, he heard an unexpected rustling from a nearby tent. Curious but wary, he crept over to check it out. Something was definitely moving within the blue tent ahead. The sounds were quiet, as if someone or something was trying to make as little noise as possible. The idea of something hiding from Black Nail triggered his predator instincts. Surely, it wouldn't be hiding if it didn't have something to hide? Something Black Nail wanted. Silently, the hobgoblin approached the entrance to the tent. He carefully grabbed the entrance flap, and then he ripped it open so he could peer inside. He had a brief glimpse of a naked woman huddled among a pile of blankets and holding one to her chest, before the tin plate she had thrown smashed into his face. Black Nail hissed in pain and staggered back from the tent. The woman began to scream fearfully. Outside the tent, Black Nail hopped around in pain. Black Nail's nose had taken the brunt of the hit, and had started to throb painfully. It hurt a lot. He rubbed his nose, and then pinched the end. Neither of which really helped at all. The woman continued screaming shrilly, which on top of everything else hurt his ears. The commotion attracted Cedar and several other bandits. His master calmly took in the sight of the obviously pained hobgoblin and the screams from the tent. Well, what do we have here? Cedar asked. Sounds like a woman to me, one of the other bandits replied eagerly. She hit me. Black Nail whined pitifully to his master. Some man-slaying monster you are. I'm glad none of our prisoners are here to see this. They're terrified of our killer hobgoblin, Cedar remarked as he smirked. A few of the other bandits chuckled as well. Black Nail gave them a hostile glare, but that only made them chuckle more. Cedar turned to the tent and addressed the occupant. Come out now and you won't be harmed. Stay in there and you won't like what happens next, Cedar commanded. Nothing happened for a few seconds. Then there was a brief ruffling noise, and the woman who had assaulted Black Nail stepped out of the tent. Her hair was long and blonde, and her eyes were light blue. Her thin but mature figure and large breasts were covered only by blanket she had wrapped around herself. One of the bandits whistled appreciatively. Black Nail rubbed his sore nose, and glared at her. He thought she was ugly, smelly and stupid. The woman was pale and shivering ever so slightly with fear. Her eyes were wet and glossy as she met the stares of the bandits, but she did meet them. She only flinched when she noticed Black Nail glaring at her hatefully. She seemed determined not to let her fear show. And who might you be? Cedar asked her politely. There was a silly smile on his face that Black Nail didn't recognize. My name is Irissa, sir. I was traveling to Riverdown with some merchants, when they were killed by Basgus. He took me prisoner and used me to warm his bed, she answered with a slight tremor in her voice. May I ask who you are? She appeared afraid, and smelled of fear as well, but Black Nail noticed her give every bandit a brief appraising look. This woman wasn't helpless. Ah, we're bandits as well, but of a less crude sort. Who's this Basgus you speak of? Cedar replied carefully. The blonde looked weary but replied quickly. He's the big leader of the bandits here, she stuttered with evident confusion. She seemed to have disregarded the other bandits and was now focusing on Cedar. She stepped towards him until she was within an easy arm's reach. Then, she looked up and met his gaze. Ah, him. He's dead, so you don't need to worry, Cedar told her as he fidgeted and looked uncomfortable. Wah, what are you going to do to me? Irissa asked. Nothing you haven't been through before I'm sure, one bandit joked. Cedar tore his gaze away from Irissa and gave him a brief disapproving look. You're our prisoner for now, but behave yourself and we'll drop you off at Riverdown, he told her. Irissa looked somewhat, but far from completely, relieved at the older man's words. Thank you, she simpered gratefully as she held the blanket to her chest and Cedar smiled at her. Wait a second, I just realized something, a shorter bandit suddenly blurted out. What? Cedar asked impatiently. According to Herod's rules she goes to whoever found her, but that wasn't you. Black Nail was the one that found her, he explained. Everyone, including the woman, turned to look at the hobgoblin. Startled at all the unexpected attention, Black Nail gave them a flat uncomprehending look back. Then she's mine until we find somewhere to get rid of her, Cedar told everyone. How do you know Black Nail doesn't want her? I mean, there are stories about hobgoblins and women who get lost in the woods, another bandit asked. Irissa suddenly looked terrified. She took another step towards Cedar until she was practically pressed against him. Black Nail's master reached over and smacked the bandit that has just spoken across the side of the head. You're definitely not a farm boy, or you'd know why those are tall tales. I'm not going to explain the birds and the bees to you, but you should know it doesn't work that way. If it did we would be up to our eyeballs in forest nymphs and frog knights, Cedar answered him scathingly. I was just saying, the red-faced bandit muttered as he massaged the side of his head. Several of his fellows were smiling or chuckling at his expense. Irissa just looked really relieved, and Black Nail didn't quite understand what was going on. Did they expect him to eat her? She smells bad, Black Nail said. Several bandits broke out into laughter. Even Cedar looked amused. The blonde woman's one eye twitched and she scowled at Black Nail. The hobgoblin was now even more confused. Did the stupid woman want to be eaten? He scowled back at her. I'm leaving, Black Nail muttered as he began to walk away. There were still places in the camp he hadn't explored yet, and his master was acting all weird. Being alone right now sounded like a great idea. Eventually, after the hobgoblin had claimed a few more trophies for himself, the deserters were released. After all their weapons were collected they were allowed to start packing up. Red Dog planned to sleep over at the camp and then head back with the new recruits in the morning. They set up all their own gear in one corner of the camp and put several men on watch. Both Red Dog and Cedar thought the deserters were sincere in their surrender and desire to join Herod, but neither of them was willing to put themselves at risk to test it either. As night fell, everyone began to lie up for the night. Several of Red Dog's men were seated around a fire in the center of their encampment. A pale waxing moon had risen in the sky. Every once in a while a pale cloud would float past and hide it from view. It's been a long time since I've had army rations, one of the men around the fire told his companions. Me too. I didn't miss them, another replied with a scowl of distaste. Black Nail was sitting in the shadows, and observing them. He could have joined them but didn't feel like it. He was in a foul mood. His master had retired to his tent along with the stupid blonde woman. At first they had talked for a while and Cedar had acted all weird. Now, Black Nail could hear them mating and it was disgusting. Mating among goblins was simple. A female went into heat and then the last male standing got to claim her. All the weird talking they were doing was disturbing. Forget about the food. What I want is chance with that bountiful blonde we picked up today, a taller black-haired bandit interjected. Ha, good luck with that. By Herod's rules she belongs to Cedar. He was the second to find her, even if you don't count Black Nail as the first. No way is he going to give her up now. She's got her hooks into him good, the sole female bandit in the group responded. Grr, why him? He's an old crusty bastard, the taller bandit asked. Ha, he may not normally seem like it these days, but Cedar used to be a famous lady killer. He was a regular master of seduction, a shorter bandit told him. Besides, he was clearly in charge and Blondie could see it. She's not stupid and obviously knows what's what, the outlaw woman added. Yay, I have a hard time seeing Cedar as a lady killer, someone else replied. I don't know, if he were a dozen years younger, and didn't scowl so much, I think he would be fairly handsome. He's certainly got the tall, dark, and handsome thing down, the woman mused. Well, damn that bastard anyway, and his stupid pet too. We're supposed to be bandits, not gentlemen bloody thieves. He could at least share, the taller bandit exclaimed. He stopped ranting suddenly when he noticed everyone else at the fire was staring slightly behind him. He froze then grimaced regretfully. Cedar's behind me isn't he, the man groaned. It's worse than that, the man to his left told him. As if on cue, Black Nail leaned down over the short man's shoulder and glared at him. The bandit froze. Their eyes remained locked for a few seconds, as Black Nail reached down and took the man's plate of food from his hand. He stared hard into the other man's eyes as if challenging him to say something about it. The man didn't so much as breathe. Smugly, the hobgoblin then walked back over to the shadows and started eating. A chorus of quiet chuckles broke out behind him. Black Nail felt a little better now. As he was eating he saw Red Dog emerge from his tent. He walked over to the fire and started talking quietly to one of the men beside the fire. The man responded and then got up and walked away from the fire and out into the darkness. He was headed across the camp to where the deserters were. Black Nail watched with interest. What was Red Dog doing? The bandit lieutenant was now just standing beside the fire and waiting. The hobgoblin stared out into the darkness that encircled them for any sign of activity. A few minutes later, a sudden clanging noise off in the night drew his attention. Then, without warning, Black Nail was blinded by a searing white light. It flashed into existence across the camp and illuminated the entire area. Its radiance poured over Black Nail, and he hissed in distress as he tried to shield his eyes from the light that burned them. What was this unnatural light? It was unlike anything he had ever seen. Sounds of surprise and confusion rung out from the bandit camp. Alarmed, the hobgoblin rolled behind the crate he was sitting on and sheltered in the shadows behind it. From his hiding spot he heard the sound of approaching footsteps. Still somewhat blinded by the white after-images that filled his eyesight, a nervous Black Nail drew his dagger. Just what was going on? Written in blood 8. Only the fact that no one was yelling or screaming stopped Black Nail from panicking. As his eyes adjusted to the light he peeked curiously out from his hiding spot, so that only his eyes and long green nose were visible. Within the light he saw two men walking towards Red Dog. One was the man Red Dog had sent out a few minutes ago, and the other was the plain-looking deserter with the staff. The bright white light that was stinging Black Nail's eyes poured forth from the end of the man's weapon. The staff didn't look like a torch to Black Nail. The light it cast was a very different color from torchlight and much stronger. Black Nail had also never seen a staff like that before either. Dimly, he remembered some fragments of conversation he had overheard. The light must be magic, which made the man a mage. The idea of real magic intrigued Black Nail. From what he had heard it was very dangerous and exciting stuff. When the two men arrived the mage's staff slowly dimmed until it went completely dark, and only the light from the campfire was left. There was a ruffling noise from Cedar's tent as the older man stepped out of his tent and walked over to the mage and Red Dog. The light must have grabbed his attention, it had certainly grabbed everyone else's. Black Nail climbed out of hiding and back onto the crate. There didn't seem to be any immediate danger and Cedar didn't seem alarmed. From his perch the hobgoblin stared intently at the staff wielder. He wanted to see some more magic. He didn't know much about it but he was pretty sure it could make things explode and catch fire, which he really wanted to see. Meanwhile, Red Dog was giving the mage an indifferent look. If you were trying to impress me with that light show then you failed. Even I know light crystals are the one type every single guild has. They're the magical equivalent of dirt. It also seems like a bloody pointless waste of a crystal you'll probably never be able to replace, Red Dog said as Cedar walked up beside him. The older man grunted in agreement. The mage was an average-sized man with short brown hair, and brown eyes. Like all the other deserters he was unshaven and dressed in worn-out Elorian military garb. As he listened to Red Dog an amused smile appeared on his face. Greetings, now that things have settled down for a little bit let me formally introduce myself. My name is Mahedium, former combat mage for the Royal Elorian 2nd Infantry Brigade. I'm glad you called for me. As you can probably imagine I've some questions I wouldn't mind asking you, he said. We have some questions of our own for you first, Red Dog replied sternly. Ask away then, Mahedium said, as he turned his palms up in a gesture of openness. How and why exactly did a vessel and a mage end up deserting together? Life in the Elorian infantry isn't fun for anyone these days, but mages and vessels are the elite. They're treated much better than most. Few of them ever end up deserting, Red Dog asked. Ah, that is a perceptive question. Baskus, our former leader, was a very arrogant man. He may have been a vessel but he was still common-born. He felt he deserved promotion, but with no noble blood it was unlikely to ever happen. That didn't stop him from trying though, and his persistence earned him many enemies. Eventually, he decided he would be better off striking out on his own, the mage answered. What about you? Cedar asked. My story is somewhat similar actually. I made some enemies among my superiors. So, when I learned of Baskus' plans I offered him my services, Mahedium replied. Cedar eyed the man, and scowled. He seemed skeptical. Your guild suspected you were doing experiments on your own. They were right too, so you ran, he guessed. Surprise flashed across the mage's face for a second, and he twitched slightly. He quickly forced a smile though. Ah, yes. I have to say you two are unexpectedly insightful for outlaws. May I ask how you figured it out, he said. It wasn't hard. Combat mages aren't taught how to actually make crystals. They're only taught how to use them in combat. Yet, you were willing to burn a crystal to produce that light earlier. That's something a mage with limited magic wouldn't do, unless they were an idiot, Cedar explained casually as he shrugged. Surely, there must be more to it than that. Mahedium asked. You also mentioned having problems with your superiors. Asking the wrong type of question were you? I've known a few combat mages, and none of them liked being dependent on the guilds for their magic. Plus, you just seem like the sort who would try to pry into the secrets of the guilds even if it meant putting your own life at risk, Cedar added. Mahedium gave a self-depreciating chuckle. I see. You're completely right. I used to be an apothecary, until I was drafted. During training I was tested for the mage gift and accepted into the Fiery Eye Guild. Then they shipped me off to the front, and I realized I was nothing but a disposable tool to them. Without connections or money I would never be taught the real secrets of magic, and my ignorance would make me dependent on them for my power, the mage replied bitterly. So you asked questions and experimented, Red Dog remarked. Yes, and I got results. The formulas and processes involved in the creation of monocrystals are complex and tightly held secrets. Every guild has different ones it knows how to make. But, you were right when you said that the light crystal was the exception. The fiery eye was not too concerned about information on light crystals leaking. So with luck and a little experimentation I was able to learn to create them. Mahedium declared victoriously. And now you're on the run, but at least you can make magical torches, Cedar replied sarcastically. That's true for now, but not forever. With my knowledge of how to create light crystals I can experiment and discover other formula. Mahedium declared excitedly. And blow yourself up, Red Dog said with a roll of his eyes. I'm aware of the dangers involved, but I have some clues and ideas that should reduce the risk, he replied defensively. Sure, as long as you do it well away from me, Red Dog told him dismissively. I hope I've answered all your questions. Now if you don't mind I have some of my own, the mage asked. Knock yourself out, Red Dog told him. Mahedium threw an inquisitive glance Black Nail's way. The hobgoblin met his gaze, even though it made him nervous. He was fairly sure the mage couldn't set him on fire with his mind, or at least wouldn't. Cedar wouldn't like it. I must admit that I am extremely interested in your hobgoblin. As unusual as it is for mages and vessels to desert, I have never even heard of a trained hobgoblin before. He was rather effective earlier, he remarked. Cedar smirked with obvious pride. Red Dog rolled his eyes at the other man's behavior. Not much to say. I found a goblin then trained it. I just had to beat some sense into it when it became a hob, Cedar replied. If only, Red Dog muttered. The mage gave them both uncomprehending looks. That's it, he asked Cedar. That's it, Cedar answered. Black Nail scowled at his master's words. He remembered things quite differently than that. For one thing he thought he deserved at least some of the credit. I see. Well, now that we have gotten to know each other I would like to ask for our weapons to be returned to us, Mahedium told them. And why should we do that? Red Dog asked with a skeptical frown. It was only Baskus who didn't want to join up with Herad. He just dragged the rest of us along with him. We have no reason to turn on you. Just like you said earlier, the wilds are a dangerous place and, Mahedium started to explain. Black Nail yawned. He had grown bored with all the talk, and didn't think the mage was going to be doing any more magic. He stood up and decided to get some sleep. He wanted to use the tent he had taken as a trophy as well. It would probably be much nicer than sleeping on the ground. As the night progressed everyone eventually drifted off to sleep. When dawn came the deserters' camp was busy with activity. Everything that could possibly be moved was being packed away, so it could be transported to Herad's base. Soon Red Dog, Cedar, and the rest of the bandits were on their way back. With almost double the amount of men they had started off with. Herad should be happy when we get back. Or at least as close as she gets, Red Dog proudly told the others. He was standing tall with his chest puffed out. Black Nail thought it made him look fat. They were making their way through the woods and back to the road. The tall shady trees around them were alive with morning bird song. Every member of their group had a backpack stuffed full of supplies and loot, even Black Nail. When Black Nail stopped for a second to look over a small patch of red mushrooms that had caught his eye, a group of deserters passed him by. Most of them ignored him, or shied away from him and tried not to catch his eye. One bandit that was wearing a brown feathered cap gave him a disdainful look. Look, it's got a sword. Ha, I'll eat my hat if the critter can actually use it, he muttered to the man beside him. The other man's eyebrows rose and he gave the speaker a disbelieving look. Don't tempt fate, fool, he replied before stepping away. Black Nail ignored them. He was more interested in whether the mushrooms he was looking at were edible. The red color probably meant they were poisonous, but it also made them look very tasty. With a sigh, he decided against eating them. He picked one to show Cedar so he would know for later though. The wind shifted and a breeze blew through the trees. Leaves rustled and the smell of healthy growing things surrounded the hobgoblin. However, under the more powerful sense something else lurked, and drew Black Nail's attention. Instinct took over. He froze and his heart sped up. The sound of its pounding filled his ears. He twitched as he fought a sudden urge to run. Instead he took a quick look around and forced himself to relax. He saw nothing lurking nearby among the trees. With no signs of immediate danger evident he started walking up the line and past the other men to find Cedar. Cedar was up ahead talking to Red Dog at the front of the group. Mahedium and some of Red Dog's men were walking right behind them. After another quick nervous look around just to be sure, Black Nail moved up beside Cedar. He was trying to act calm but his movements were jerky and stiff. He didn't want to alert anything that was watching that he had detected them. Cedar broke off his conversation with Red Dog as the hobgoblin approached. He looked over and gave Black Nail a puzzled glance. Black Nail was fidgeting and clearly nervous about something. I smell the troll. It's downwind, being sneaky, Black Nail whispered to his master. Almost immediately he felt kind of stupid. He was fairly sure trolls couldn't understand human speech so there had been no real reason to whisper. Shit, Cedar swore. He grimaced and closed his eyes for a second as he began to think things through. What is it? Red Dog asked. That troll's back, and it's stalking us, Cedar replied darkly. Red Dog added a long string of his own curses to Cedar's. Black Nail didn't understand most of them. We'll need to prepare and make sure everyone's ready, Red Dog said when he had finally stopped swearing. If we can make ourselves look like more trouble than we're worth it might back off without a fight. The trick will be getting ready without tipping it off, Cedar added. Red Dog nodded in agreement. He then turned around and called to the group behind him. Mahedium, come up here for a second, he said. The mage gave them a curious look as he picked up his pace and walked over to them. What do you need? He asked. That troll friend of yours is back. I want to know if you've got any tricks that might be useful, and don't think of holding anything back just because you can't replace it, Red Dog told him. The mage flinched fearfully before responding. For use against a troll? I have no idea what would work. They're hardly my area of expertise. I mean I have a few heat crystals, and obviously I have light crystals I can use to blind it. I also have a force crystal I've been saving, but that's it, he replied nervously. That's all you got? You're of the Fiery Eye, and they're one of the most hardcore combat guilds around, Red Dog remarked with an eyebrow raised doubtfully. I wasn't actually at the front when I took my leave of the army. The guilds only give combat mages the crystals they think we need, so most of what I have is support spells, Mahedium explained. Fine, go for the heat then. Just be damn sure you have a clear shot before you fire. I've seen what those things can do to a man, and I don't want to see it again, Red Dog told him. Probably your best bet, Cedar added in agreement. Red Dog began carefully giving out orders. As the line of bandits hiked through the woods he called several to him one at a time. When the men returned to their place in the line they whispered to their nearby companions. While this was happening Mahedium went to work as well. The mage quickly began disassembling his staff in a practiced manner. He replaced the white crystal within the staff's mechanism with a red one, and then made some adjustments that narrowed the staff's metal head. Slowly, the bandit group began to split until it had divided itself into small units. The transformation was gradual but soon every unit had someone watching each direction, and every bandit had a hand ready to draw their weapon. Just as the group furthest from the front was forming up there came a scream. Black Nail whipped around in time to see something explode from the bushes. At first it was nothing but a green blur, but then it smashed through a group of men in the middle of the line and slowed almost to a stop. Men screamed in pain and surprise as the green behemoth roared and sent clumps of earth, broken branches, and bloodied men flying. Even while stooped over the troll towered 1 or 2 feet over the few men still standing around it. It had bizarrely elongated arms that reached all the way down from its broad hunched shoulders to the ground. Heavy muscles rippled under its greenish-gray skin as it spun furiously and whipped its heavy clawed fists around to batter and break anyone unlucky enough to get too close to it. The troll's head was similar to a hobgoblin's but with a thick extended lizard-like snout. A dirty mane of brown hair grew from the top of its head and down its back. As it attacked it opened its mouth to let out a savage roar, which revealed countless jagged yellow teeth and 2 massive blade-like fangs that descended down past its jaw. It wasn't the troll's strength or size that alarmed Black Nail though. No, what truly frightened him was the beast's speed. It seemed to jerk and twist as it moved, but it did it so quickly it was almost impossible to keep track of. Instinctively, Black Nail knew that any attempt to run from the predator would be doomed. In a violent frenzy of motion the troll ripped into the men that surrounded it. Its fists smashed them aside like paper dolls and sent them flying. They barely had any time to react or even draw their weapons. Then the beast screamed in elated rage as it snatched up a shocked bandit in its claws. It brought the shrieking man up to its mouth, and bit down on him. Its huge fangs sunk into its prey with a wet cracking noise. The man's chest seemed to just collapse in on itself into a bloody ruin. With a mocking satisfied hiss and a powerful lunge the troll broke through the scattered and bloodied men around it and charged off into the woods. It used its long arms and knuckles like a second pair of legs as it ripped through the underbrush. Suddenly just as the troll was about to disappear there was a hissing noise off to one side of Black Nail and the air rippled. A wave of heat washed over him and the hobgoblin cringed away. Then there was a sharp crack and the base of a tree near where the troll had been seconds ago exploded into flames. Startled, Black Nail looked over his shoulder to see Mahedium standing frozen in place. Heat radiated from the metal head of his staff. The mage wore a shocked expression and his knuckles were pale and white from gripping his staff so tightly, but he was pointing his weapon in the general direction that troll had gone. Apparently magic could do much more than create light after all, but you still had to aim it properly. All in all, the savage onslaught had lasted but seconds. All the dozens of bandits could do was gape in stunned horror and take in the destruction the troll had wrought around them. For a moment the forest was quiet except for the moans of the wounded. Then as the shock dissipated shrill screams of pain and panicked cursing filled the air. Half a dozen men the troll has passed by lay strewn across the ground or had been dashed against trees. The air was thick with the mingled scent of blood and the putrid stench of the troll. Fire and damnation. Fucking trolls. Drakes are worse my ass. Red Dog swore as he stomped off and began shouting orders. He had to yell at the top of his lungs to be heard over everyone else. Nervously, Black Nail stood up from where he had instinctively crouched behind Cedar. His master gave him a hard unamused stare, and the hobgoblin gave him an apologetic smile back. Irissa had fallen backwards in shock and landed butt first on the ground where she was shivering in terror. Cedar crouched down beside her and began to whisper reassuringly in her ear. Red Dog was still shouting, and he had even drawn his sword and started waving it around to get attention. Slowly he managed to get things calmed down and somewhat organized. Cedar got up from where he was tending to Irissa and made his way over to Red Dog. The other man was yelling at a small group of bandits. He pointed off in one direction and they jogged over to help the wounded. That left Red Dog standing there by himself and glowering darkly at nothing. We have a problem, Cedar told Red Dog. Very slowly the bandit lieutenant looked over. Red Dog's face twitched as a mix of emotions warred within him. Finally he settled on an incredibly dark and hostile glare which he aimed directly at Cedar. I know we have a fucking problem. We have more problems than there are hells right now. Red Dog hissed. But you don't know the real problem, Cedar replied calmly. Oh, and what might that be? Red Dog asked with a snarl. That wasn't normal troll behavior, not even close. That thing was an experienced man-eater, with a taste for human flesh. It will be back, repeatedly. Even if we head home it will just follow us, the grey-haired older man explained. Of course it fucking is. Go slay the deserters, she says. It will be easy, she says. She just forgot to mention the bloody huge slosher, the combat mage, and the man-eating troll. I've had enough of this. We're making a break for the base. Then the troll will be Herod's problem, Red Dog swore. Black Nail liked that plan. He was sure he could outrun most the humans without a problem, and it was a man-eating troll anyway. Not a goblin-eating troll. Yep, his survival was practically guaranteed. If we do that we'll lose a lot of men. The troll might even get you or me, since we can't predict where it will strike, Cedar told him. Black Nail frowned. He didn't like where this was going. You have a better idea, old man? Red Dog asked. Yes, I'll take 7 or 8 of our more experienced men and trail the troll back to its lair. We'll corner it there and finish it off. That will give you and the wounded time to get going, Cedar suggested. Dangerous. You would be putting experienced men at risk to save the wounded and rookies. Do you really think you can do it? Red Dog replied skeptically. This is what I do, Cedar told him. Very well. Good luck then, and may all the gods bless your path, old man, Red Dog replied. Cedar nodded and then turned to Black Nail. Come on, we have a lot of hard dangerous work ahead of us, Cedar told the hobgoblin. Black Nail sighed. Of course his master didn't like Red Dog's plan, and of course his idea put him right in the most dangerous place possible. The hobgoblin was beginning to wonder if his master was trying to get himself killed, and take Black Nail with him. Written in Blood 9. It only took Cedar a few minutes to round up his pick of the men. None of them looked thrilled at being selected, although 1 or 2 agreed that it was necessary. All the men Cedar picked were among the most experienced of the bandits and were familiar with the forest, except for Mahedium. The mage made his objections to joining the hunt clear, but in the end he had no choice. Mage or not, he was still not even a proper member. Before Red Dog's group had gotten moving again, Cedar led his party after the troll. It was not difficult to spot the beginning of its trail. The troll had simply torn through the forest at full speed while carrying a human body. Branches had been snapped, the earth was torn up, and blood littered the ground. Cedar led the way. He didn't even have to stop and look for signs. He just had to follow the trail of destruction the troll had blazed. It was obvious to everyone which way to go. Black Nail followed his master and scanned the surroundings for danger. Cedar seemed sure that the troll was long gone, but that didn't mean the forest was safe. Black Nail thought chasing a troll through the woods was an incredibly stupid idea, even without considering what would happen when you actually caught it. The easy-to-follow path soon ended when the party came across a wide creek that meandered through the woods. Cold water raced and bubbled over a stone-filled stream bed that was wider than a man was tall. Its banks were rocky and mostly clear of plants, except for the occasional scraggly sapling or patch of grass. The beast's trail stopped abruptly at the water's edge. Black Nail walked across the creek and sniffed the ground. He felt a nervous shiver work its way up his spine when he failed to pick up the troll's trail again on the other side. The idea that the troll was both smart enough to lose him and could be anywhere now made him nervous. He looked up and scanned the forest for any signs of it. The trees here were mostly tall evergreens with long needles instead of leaves. Close to the ground their straight smooth white trunks were mostly bereft of anything but the remains of broken dead branches. Higher up the tops of the trees were green and healthy looking though. The ground was rocky enough that in some areas the trees were forced to grow fairly far apart. These spaces were filled by sparse stretches of grass, and the earth was littered with fallen brown pine needles. There was no sign of the troll, and not a lot of places for something so big to hide. Cedar's boots got wet as he splashed across the creek after Black Nail. He examined the forest for a few seconds before saying anything. Let me guess, you've lost the trail, he asked Black Nail. Yes, it's gone, Black Nail answered with a frown. Cedar didn't seem surprised. It used the water to hide its scent, and it will be moving more carefully now. It's probably more worried about another predator stealing its meal than us catching up with it, but the result's the same, the old scout explained. What do we do now? Black Nail asked his master. He hoped this meant they would turn around and go home now, but deep down he knew better. We split into 2 groups. One goes upstream and the other down. It can't have gone too far. A whistle should do a signal, Cedar replied. He then turned and cast a skeptical gaze over the other bandits who were loitering at the stream's far bank. I'll take upstream. Georges, you will lead the group that goes downstream and you'll take Black Nail with you, Cedar told everyone after a brief pause to think. Georges gave Cedar a mildly annoyed look. He was an average-sized bandit with short blonde hair, and a jagged scar that stretched back from one corner of his mouth. It looked as if someone had shoved a knife in his mouth and tried to slice his cheek in half. The long scar made it seem like one side of his face was always frowning. All right, whatever Cedar, he replied. It was clear he was insulted by Cedar's obvious lack of faith in his tracking ability. Cedar split the group, and Black Nail followed Georges as they headed downstream in the opposite direction as Cedar. Mahedium stuck with Cedar. The mage was clearly nervous to be out in the forest, and kept throwing nervous glances at the forest around him. Most the bandits walked on one side of the creek or the other. However, Black Nail had taken off his boots and kept walking through the water barefoot so that he could sniff both sides. The cool water felt refreshing on the hobgoblin's feet as it flowed over his skin. The stones and pebbles at the bottom of the creek were smooth enough that they didn't poke his soles when he stepped on them. Even though the water was very shallow except for the occasional eddy-dug pool, Black Nail kept an eye out for snapping turtles. He hadn't forgotten that lesson. As long as he kept an eye out for the snappers, Black Nail thought the creek was probably a safer place to be than walking along the bank. If someone was going to stumble into a mimic or spider, it wasn't going to be him. Of course, it was always possible that Cedar had simply forgotten to tell him about some sort of terrifying beast that lived in streams. That would be just like him. Georges seemed to be doing a good job searching for signs of the troll to Black Nail. He didn't know why Cedar had doubted the man's ability to track. Then again, Black Nail knew he was far from an expert on tracking by sight. The hobgoblin himself hadn't caught the scent of the troll or human blood yet. He had however come across quite a few other interesting scents. He had smelled deer, rabbits, harpies, and some other things he couldn't identify. They must have all come to the creek to get a drink. Black Nail was just about to cross the stream again when he heard a whistle. He looked up, but none of the humans seemed to have heard anything. They continued to follow the creek downstream while checking the bush for signs of the troll. "Georges, I heard the whistle," Black Nail yelled to the man, who was on the other side of the creek. Georges turned to look at Black Nail and then back up the stream. He frowned and seemed to think things over for a second. "Right, you have those long pointy goblin ears. Let's get back then." "It seems like we've gone the wrong way," he replied. He then called the other men over and they headed back. After a brief trek upstream, they found Cedar standing in the forest a few feet from the water. The rest of the bandits were resting around him. "Took you long enough. While you were off taking a stroll, I found the troll's trail," Cedar remarked. "I figured that," Georges replied dryly. "Come on, let's get going." "I don't want to be hunting this thing in the dark," Cedar told them. "I don't want to hunt it at all," Black Nail muttered to himself. He then walked up to where his master was standing and sniffed the ground. Sure enough, he could smell the troll. This was definitely where it had left the water. The hobgoblin didn't see a single visual sign though. He had no idea how Cedar had found it, and before he could ask, the grey-haired man was forging ahead. The troll had headed through the trees and uphill. Pines and a scattering of other scraggly trees grew from a rocky upward slope. Large stones jutted out from the sides of the nearby hills, like cold grey bones from torn flesh. The way was steep and difficult because the rocky ground made for treacherous footing. It came loose and crumbled out from under the bandits' feet as they tried to make their way up. Soon the climb began to take a toll on everyone and they started to grow tired. Black Nail was the best off. His light lanky build made the journey easier for him. Cedar called for a stop when everyone started to show signs of exhaustion. As they had made their way up the hills, the trees had grown thinner and thinner, until mostly only bushes remained. From where he had stopped to rest and sit on a rock, Black Nail suddenly heard movement from up above. He hissed in alarm and leaped to his feet. A frightening image of the troll jumping down on them from above and massacring them flashed through his mind. A small shower of rocks rained down on him from the ledge above as he moved. They banged loudly against each other and threw up dust as they fell. As Black Nail jumped aside to avoid them, he got a better look at the ledge they had fallen from. He felt a stab of fear in his chest when he noticed a creature staring down at him from there. Two large, dangerous-looking curled horns rose from its head and curled back behind its ears. Its body was covered in grey hair and it gazed at the bandits below with narrowed, malevolent eyes. It even had a beard-like tuft of hair growing from its chin. "Baya!" It growled angrily at the hobgoblin as it reared up onto its back legs in challenge. Clearly it was hungry for human and goblin flesh. It had 4 hooves like a horse but didn't look quite as stupid, evil, and twisted as one. Black Nail slowly reached for his blade and began to slide it free from its sheath. He intended to strike first and kill it before it could attack them, but Cedar walked up and placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's a wild goat, Black Nail. Relax, if you leave it alone it will leave you alone," Cedar said with a hint of amusement in his voice. Black Nail let his sword slide back into his sheath, but kept his eyes on the beast. It stared back and their eyes met. Black Nail hissed and the goat let out another growl of its own. Then, with what Black Nail would swear was a condescending look, the goat turned and bounded higher up the hill. Its hooves kicked up more rocks and sent them raining down over the bandits as it jumped. 2 smaller goats then burst from the bushes nearby and joined the larger one, before they all disappeared up the hill together. "That's good luck," one of the bandits commented. "Rock goats and trolls are supposed to be enemies. Seeing them on a troll hunt is a sign of a god's blessing." There were nods of agreement from most the other men. Personally, Black Nail doubted any god or spirit would bless someone by sending them an angry goat. "All right, enough lazing about. Time to get back to it," Cedar called out a few minutes later. There were quite a few grunts and sighs as the bandits got back to their feet and continued on up the hill. The ground began to level out, and a few more evergreen trees appeared. Cedar held up a hand to signal a stop. Up ahead past a grove of trees a large pile of boulders and rocks rose from the ground. Black Nail noticed a large dark crevice on one side of it. Behind the rocks the forest continued. "I'm willing to bet good gold that's where our troll's lair is. The question is whether it's in there right now," Cedar whispered. "There's only one real way to find out, but before we go in there I'd like to at least have a plan with a half-decent chance of working," Georges remarked. "Fair enough," Cedar answered. He put his knapsack down on a log and removed several long lengths of cord from it. Then he reached back into the bag and pulled out a bunch of wicked-looking barbed steel arrows. "We'll go in all together. Mage Boy here will be in the back. He'll be lighting our way, and when we see the troll he'll turn the light up as high as possible and blind it. With our backs to him and with our eyes more used to the light we should be able to see fine. While the beast's blinded, our best archers will shoot it with these arrows," Cedar told them. Georges have him a skeptical look. "Trolls have hides tougher than good leather and their wounds don't bleed properly, so they're hard to put down. Arrows, Even barbed ones won't do much, he remarked. True, but they don't have to. The arrows will be tied by long ropes to climbing hooks. While the trolls still distracted, another few men will find places in the cave to attach them. That'll lock it down and prevent it from attacking us. Then when it's all tied up we'll go in for the kill, Cedar explained. That sounds complicated and dangerous to me. What if the troll doesn't do what you think it will? Someone replied uncertainly. Do you have a better plan? Cedar asked harshly. No? Then let's get going. Cedar handed out the equipment and once they had it all prepared they headed over to the cave. Remind me to train you with a bow sometime, Cedar told Blacknail as they moved. All the bandits, except for Cedar, looked nervous. Their skin had gone pale and Blacknail could tell they had started to sweat more by their scent. Every one of them had drawn their weapons. As they approached the dark mouth of the cave, Blacknail's sense of smell was overwhelmed by the foul stench of rotten meat and troll body odor. It seeped from the cave so thickly Blacknail almost thought he could taste it with his skin. He gagged, and was quickly joined by several humans. One of them even vomited as he approached the cave mouth, and that did nothing to improve the smell. Suddenly the area grew brighter and the first few steps of the cave were stripped of shadows. Mahedium had activated his staff and it blazed with pure white light. No one entered the cave. Blacknail threw a questioning look at the man next to him. You first, the man whispered. No, you, Blacknail hissed back. One of his companions pushed the man forward. He took a stumbling step but then turned and glared at the other man without going further. Georges sighed and stepped forward. Let's get going, he told the reluctant man in front as he poked him with his blade. Together the two of them took the first few steps into the cave mouth. A few seconds later, when neither of them was ripped apart, the other bandits and Blacknail followed them in. A long rough grey rock corridor extended before them and curved out of sight a few dozen feet away. Rows of short stalagmites hung from the ceiling. The dirt floor was littered with bones and jagged rocks, but none of the rocks were nearly big enough for a troll to hide behind. It wasn't there. Everyone let out a collective sigh of relief. It must be deeper in. Let's go, Cedar whispered. The bandits began to slowly and reluctantly move forward. Maybe it was just the heat and vile stench, but the cave felt humid and wet to Blacknail. He began to grow itchy, but he didn't dare scratch himself. That would require use of one of his hands, and for him to lower his guard. As they moved deeper underground the air grew warmer and the trolls' kills fresher. Blood and gobs of flesh started to appear on the remains scattered all over the floor. Blacknail and the others had to go out of their way not to step on them. It was an unpleasant distraction from the hobgoblin's focus on not getting killed and eaten. Up ahead on a small ledge against one wall a large mound of dark wet earth was piled. A small forest of mushrooms grew atop of it. Crawling between the stems and colorful mushroom cups were the shiny forms of harvesters. They were apparently more common out here in the wild than in the sewers, where men trained goblins to remove them. The mage's radiant staff almost caused them to glow as their carapaces split the light and reflected it back in a rainbow of colors. The mouse-sized bugs were busy carrying dirt and other less pleasant things around. Every once a while one would appear from, or disappear into, small holes in the wall. As they advanced through the twisted rock tunnel the hobgoblin saw several other harvester farms where the bugs were growing their mushrooms. They seemed to be thriving in the troll's lair where there was abundant food, and the beast scared other animals away. Blacknail's thoughts were suddenly interrupted by a loud sinister growl that echoed through the cave. The walls of the cavern almost seemed to vibrate as the sound washed over them. The man beside Blacknail stiffened in fear. The hobgoblin himself jumped as he felt a hand against his back. He risked a quick look back to see that it was Cedar's. His master was giving him a disapproving look, and Blacknail realized he had been unconsciously backing up. The hobgoblin gave his master a nervous smile then sighed and took a few, very small, steps forward. The previous growl from deeper in the cave was joined by a deep thundering roar. It was loud enough that it stung Blacknail's ears. Then an explosion of footsteps was heard from around the corner as the troll charged into view, and right at the bandits. The charging massive beast's eyes blazed with hate and mindless hunger, as it regarded the small weak creatures that had dared intrude upon its home. It opened its mouth to reveal jagged yellow teeth and the full length of its humongous fangs. Its dripping jaws seemed to grow ever larger and fill Blacknail's vision as the green juggernaut descended upon them. Written in blood 10. Oh shit, someone mumbled in horror. Before anyone could react the troll had already closed over half the distance between it and the bandits. Any second now it would tear through them like a sharp knife through cloth, but with a lot more blood flying everywhere. Then Mahedium unleashed his magic, and the cavern was drowned in light. It was so bright the edges of Blacknail's vision widened until they seemed foggy. The effect on the troll was impressive. It screamed horribly, as it brought its claws up to shield its face. It tried to continue its charge, but tripped over a large rock and then smashed into one of the cavern walls. Rocks were sent flying through the air and the entire cave seemed to shudder from the impact. Most of the bandits were still too terrified or stunned to move, but not Cedar. Attack now, and stick to the plan, he yelled as he shot an arrow into one of the troll's legs. At his master's command Blacknail burst into a sprint and ran past the fallen troll and deeper into the cave. The arrow Cedar had shot was tied to a climbing hook in his hand. By this point it was clear to the hobgoblin that his survival depended on the plan working. The troll didn't stay down long. Hissing and growling, it pulled itself to its feet. The green hairy behemoth seemed to fill the cave and tower over the humans as it rose. Off to one side Blacknail spotted a solid-looking rock that protruded from the floor. He grabbed it and slid to a stop. Working quickly he pulled the rope tight, wrapped it around the rock a few times, and then attached the hook. By this time Cedar's men had sprung into action. The other archers had started to lose their arrows, and Cedar was lining up his second shot. Other bandits were busy finding places to hook lines. Several ropes already led from the troll to the floor or walls. To keep the beast distracted, 3 bandits moved in with swords and threatened it, but they kept well out of reach of the troll's deadly claws. The blinded and enraged troll swiped at them as it stumbled forward, but they managed to avoid its distracted strikes. As new arrows hit their marks, the troll slowed and began to thrash and pull on the lines that entrapped it. More arrows sunk into its hide every second, but it would take far more than a few hooks and ropes to hold its massive bulk. Black Nail was the only individual who had managed to make it past the troll. The other bandits who were supposed to have joined him had all frozen in fear until it was too late. This meant most the lines only stopped the troll from moving backwards towards the hobgoblin. Black Nail was glad to see that this didn't seem to be a priority for the troll. It seemed determined to reach the humans in front of it. To prevent that from happening, several of the bandits began tossing lines past the troll and over to the hobgoblin. Black Nail rushed around to find solid places to attach them. Cedar and the others had to retreat several times in order to keep the troll from reaching them. Several lines broke or were ripped free by the beast as it pressed its furious assault forward. Eventually though, the troll ground to a halt as the lines Black Nail was securing started to arrest its movement. Blinded and confused, it roared in pained frustration. The archers weren't taking any chances though, and they didn't let up their barrage until they has used up every arrow. I wish we had some proper spears. Swords are really not the tool for this, Cedar swore as he discarded his bow and drew his blade. The other bandits did the same and began to encircle the troll. Black Nail unsheathed his own sword but decided to stay back and out of the way, lest he get in the way. The beast itself growled and stared menacingly at its assailants, but it didn't make any large movements. Every time it did more than sway slightly, several lines would go tight and pull painfully on the steel arrows embedded in its flesh. Don't try and get too close. Start on its arms and work your way in, Cedar warned everyone. With that said, the men slipped around the ropes that crisscrossed the cave and descended on the entrapped troll from every side. The beast screamed and shuddered as they began to hack at it from every direction at once. It couldn't even move enough to avoid most the attacks they rained down on it. Black Nail was surprised at how little blood was visible, even as the troll was cut again and again. Its wounds seemed to fill with some sort of thick yellowish-green fluid as soon as they were made. The bandits continued their attack relentlessly. First the screaming beast's arms went limp and useless, and then it sagged and dropped to its knees. Georges moved in to deliver a powerful two-handed swing to the troll's exposed neck. The troll saw him coming and hissed defiantly. Black Nail didn't like the look of the raw hatred he saw in its eyes. It reminded him of the depths of his own berserk rage. Before he could yell a warning, the crippled troll lurched and then launched itself forward. Arrows were ripped out of the green giant's hide and lines snapped as the troll's head shot forward and smashed into the unprepared Georges. The impact of the headbutt sent him flying across the cave until he crashed into the wall. There was a loud smacking sound and then Georges fell limply to the ground, revealing a bloody stain on the cavern wall behind him. He didn't get back up. With one last half-hearted growl, the troll then staggered and collapsed onto the ground. Its fall caused a loud thud and sent a wave of dust and grime through the cave. This forced Black Nail and several other bandits to shield their eyes for a second until the dust had blown past. It's dead. Someone check on Georges, Cedar said after examining the troll for a few moments. What if it's faking it? Someone asked nervously. Trolls don't play dead, Cedar replied with a condescending sneer. With that said, there was a collective sigh of relief, and the cave darkened as Mahedium dimmed the light of his staff. Black Nail cautiously walked up to the dead troll. He poked one of its big green feet a few times, and then relaxed when nothing happened. Moving closer, he examined the beast. It really was somewhat similar to a hobgoblin, but bigger and much uglier. It obviously had none of the charm and intelligence he had. With a smug smirk, Black Nail scrambled up onto the huge corpse, and managed to stand tall on top of it. He wondered how many hobgoblins had ever slain trolls, probably none. That would make him the first ever. The greatest hobgoblin SS ever, he bragged to himself triumphantly from his perch. The hobgoblin heard a quiet chuckle and turned around to see Cedar smiling at him. His sudden movement caused the corpse to shift under him, and Black Nail was sent sprawling to the ground. The cave was now filled with chuckles as some of the other bandits couldn't help but laugh. The thrill of victory had made Black Nail too giddy and lightheaded to be insulted. He just smiled back, and took note of who was chuckling the hardest for later. Things quickly sobered up though. The bandit that checked on Georges pronounced him dead. His skull had been cracked open and his back was broken. They built the fallen outlaw a rock cairn outside using loose rocks from the cave. Then after a quick moment of silence they left him there and moved on. Theirs was a profession where death was commonplace. A quick exploration of the cave had revealed nothing but some trinkets and a few coins found on some of the troll's victims. Black Nail claimed these. No one else wanted to dig through the grisly remains to get them. The cave went deeper than anyone was willing to explore. The troll's lair ended, but there was a small lightless side passage. The passage started with a steep drop so deep even Mahedium's staff couldn't pierce the darkness of its depths. All his white light revealed was the sharp rocks that made up the sides of the shaft itself. When a cautious Black Nail started sniffing around it, Cedar stopped him. Careful, Black Nail, don't get too close, Cedar warned him while he warily observed the opening. Unless I'm very mistaken, that leads down into the dark roads, and you really don't want to go down there. It's a strange place full of stranger beasts, and it's very easy to get trapped down there. It's a doorway to the endless hells, Black Nail heard one bandit mutter. Carefully, the hobgoblin backed away from Passage's mouth. Cedar's words had struck a chord with him. He still hadn't gotten used to being trapped in the forest with all the terrible things that lived there, and these dark roads didn't sound any better. Cedar then had everyone pull out of the cavern. They were all exhausted, but no one wanted to spend another night out in the forest. So, after a brief discussion they decided to try and meet up with Red Dog. Since they had no wounded, Cedar thought they would be able to catch up. Between the fast pace they set and the fact that it was faster moving downhill, they managed to rejoin the rest of the bandits halfway down the road back to Herod's base. Red Dog was glad to see them return, and to hear news of the troll's death. If Cedar had failed, not only would he have an angry troll to deal with but an angry Herod as well. Also in the north more numbers were always welcome, the roads were far from safe. It was entirely possible another troll could show up, or something worse. Altogether the old hands, new recruits, and former deserters arrived back at the camp before dusk. Nothing of note happened and no one else got killed. Some of the deserters seemed unsure of the reception they would receive, but everyone was still glad to have reached safety. Cedar looked a little hesitant to enter the camp though. He kept throwing looks back at Irissa, who had been staying close to him. When everyone else began entering the camp, Cedar held himself back, and stayed on the road. He was scanning the entrance to the camp as if looking for something. "What are you doing, Cedar?" Red Dog yelled back at him. "Nothing, be there in a second," Cedar replied. He then whispered something to Irissa, and began pulling her over to a group of bandits who were loitering down the road. "Ephra, you owe me a favor," he called out to one of them. A bald woman with squinty eyes looked up as he spoke. She frowned at Cedar as he walked over. "What's this about, Cedar? You may have pulled me out of the way of that mimic, but that don't mean you own me," she replied suspiciously. "You're heading to town, right?" he asked her. "Yep, in a bit anyway." "Why?" she replied. "I want you to take this woman with you. She's my spoils, and I want to make sure she gets to Riverdown unmolested," her told her. "Why can't you take her?" Ephra asked uncertainly. "I just got back, and I have to report to Herod," he explained. "Wait a second, Cedar. I've been walking all day. Why can't I rest here overnight, and then you can take me back yourself?" Irissa asked the old scout as she moved closer and hugged his arm to her chest. Cedar threw Irissa a distracted look, before turning back to the other woman. Ephra looked confused. She obviously didn't understand what he was thinking, and Blacknail didn't either. "If that's what you want, then I guess I owe you that much," Ephra told him. "It is, just make sure she gets there safely," Cedar replied. "She'll get there if I do." "I can't do more than that," Ephra said with shrug. "Cedar, why are you trying to get rid of me so suddenly?" Irissa asked with a bewildered expression. "Now Irissa, this is for your own good. Do you really want to stay out here when you could be getting back to safety?" he asked her. "Well no," she started to say, but Blacknail's master cut her off. "Good, stay here and stick close to Ephra. She'll get you there in one piece. I have to go report in now, but it was a pleasure," Cedar told her before spinning around and walking swiftly away. The attractive woman could only gape in astonishment as her lover left her behind so suddenly. Blacknail didn't know what was going on, and he didn't really care. He just followed Cedar like always. When they caught up to Red Dog and the rest of the party, they were standing before Herod. She must have had word of their coming, and wanted to show off, because the bandit chieftain was at her most intimidating. Cedar and Blacknail quietly stepped up beside Red Dog. Herod's cold dark eyes gazed malevolently out from under her short dark hair as they swept over the deserters. They cringed under her attention, except for Mahedium, who seemed relaxed and unworried. Herod's eyes lingered on the mage and his staff for a few seconds before she moved on. She looked like she was trying to choose which one of them to make an example of, or someone to make a meal of. She was dressed in her usual dark leathers, and a black cloak was draped over her shoulders. Even more knives than usual were holstered about her person, and her long sword was sheathed at her hip. She sneered as she addressed them. "These are the fools that thought they could set themselves up in my territory," she asked Red Dog. "Yes boss, this is them. There used to be a few more of them though," he answered. "If they were anything like these scum they weren't much of a loss anyway," she told him. "Well, their boss was a vessel, but also an arrogant prick. With you around he would have just been a waste of elixir anyway," Red Dog replied. "I see," Herod said as she turned away from the deserters and gave Red Dog a curious look, before facing the deserters again. "It seems you scum are in luck. We're currently in need of some new grunts, otherwise I would normally just have useless shits like you killed. Instead, you're now the lowest of my lackeys. Now swear obedience to me and then we'll see if you survive the month," she told her new recruits. Herod then had each of them take a simple oath of obedience. When that was done, she had one of her men take the recruits away for inspection and billeting. Her eyes flickered over Mahedium again as she watched them leave. When they were out of sight, she turned back to Red Dog and Cedar. "Report, now. How did you two manage to run into both a vessel and a combat mage?" she ordered them accusingly. Cedar scowled at her tone of voice, and Red Dog winced. "They were both just part of the deserters you sent us after," Red Dog explained. "How exactly did you manage to deal with the vessel?" she asked. That was when Blacknail saw his chance. He stood up tall and pointed to himself. He was so excited he was almost bouncing. Now it was finally his chance to impress Herod. "I did it. I killed the big leader man. I scared the other men so badly they gave up. Was all me," Blacknail bragged loudly to the chieftain. "Helped kill the troll too, by doing what master told me," the hobgoblin added as an afterthought. Herod frowned at him, then turned to Cedar and gave him a questioning look. She clearly didn't believe the hobgoblin. It was Red Dog who answered though. "It's sorta true boss," he told her reluctantly. Red Dog then began to give a detailed report of their mission. Despite herself, when he had finished, Herad looked somewhat impressed. Well, you two certainly earned your pay this time. Especially that hobgoblin of yours, Cedar, she remarked. The hobgoblin was confused by her choice of words and frowned. Pay was those shiny things a lot of the tribe had, right? I don't get paid, Black Nail muttered. His reaction caused Herad to laugh at him. I suppose you don't, but that's fixed easily enough. From now on you'll get paid a grunt's share of the profits. Oh, and Black Nail, since you call Cedar master, you can call me mistress, she told him with an arrogant smile. Yes, mistress, Black Nail replied as he lowered his eyes and assumed a submissive posture. Cedar looked surprised. It was unlike Herad to voluntarily part with money. Red Dog sighed, but it was a resigned sound instead of an argumentative one. Black Nail was happy at the praise but still more than a little confused. He liked coins but wasn't sure what he was going to do with more of them. He already had burrowed or picked up quite a few of them, and squirreled them away in various hiding spots with the rest of his shiny things. Herad then dismissed them and they headed off to their respective campsites. Cedar had a thoughtful look on his face. I suppose if you are drawing pay now then you're a full member of the band, and not my servant anymore, Black Nail, he told the hobgoblin. He is at that, Red Dog muttered. Black Nail felt a mix of emotions suddenly rise up into his chest. It felt a bit like gas. He had done it. Herad had accepted him as a member of her tribe. Apparently that was what getting paid meant. Coins were obviously some sort of measure of status among humans. Black Nail was going to have to make sure he hid his away carefully, somewhere no one would ever find them. On the other hand, his recent rise in the tribe seemed like it was going to change his relationship with his master. The thought made him uncomfortable. The nervous hobgoblin turned to his master. I am always your servant, Black Nail told Cedar. Not anymore. Now you're my subordinate. Don't worry, it's much the same, just more work, Cedar told Black Nail. Black Nail blinked. He wasn't sure if his master was being serious. Before he could ask his master anything though, Red Dog suddenly spoke up and interrupted their conversation. I'll see you two around. No offense, Black Nail, but I've had enough of trolls, hobgoblins, and whatever for quite a while. Yep, I'm looking forward to some uneventful rest away from every sort of forest critter imaginable, he said as he started to walk away from them and towards his tent. Before he got more than a few feet away there was a rustling sound from a nearby tent. As everyone looked over at it, a goblin burst out with dagger in his hand. It ran out in front of them, stopping only for a second when it saw Black Nail. Its eyes went wide and it dropped the dagger. It then scampered off behind another tent and out of sight. No one said anything. Seconds later, a worried-looking Varhas ran up to them. The young scout, who had helped Cedar with Black Nail's training, was about to say something when he saw the dagger on the ground. After picking it up he turned to them. Did you see which way my goblin scamp went? He asked them. Red Dog was twitching. He stared at Varhas with narrowed eyes and pursed lips. His face was growing redder by the second. Before Red Dog could say anything, Cedar turned stiffly around and immediately began walking away. He clearly had decided he had somewhere else to be. After a few seconds Black Nail followed him. There was a goblin running around his camp. This was his territory. Varhas should have asked him before bringing in a goblin. He would have to show both the goblin and Varhas who was in charge later. Right now though, sleeping sounded like a good plan. He had been walking a lot lately. The tired Cedar and Black Nail immediately headed back to their campsite. Black Nail was already scheming about how to capture the other goblin and make sure it knew whose territory this was. When they got to their campsite they were surprised to see a second tent set up beside Cedar's. Black Nail had yet to unpack the one he had won from the deserters. Oh hey, you're back, a cheerful voice called out to them. They looked over to see Kida approaching them. Whose tent is that? Cedar asked her suspiciously. It's mine. Vorshaw said she wanted some privacy with Geralt, so she got me a tent of my own and told me to set it up here, Kida replied happily. Cedar groaned, and Black Nail hissed. Yes, when he woke tomorrow up he would definitely have to do something about all the annoying little things running around the camp. Interlude, the doom of Kurolis. The young man shivered as an arctic gust blew in over the city walls and slammed into him. He pulled his heavy coat tighter in an attempt to keep the cold at bay, as snow swirled through the air around him. As the wind died down around him the city beyond was revealed. Stone and wooden buildings lined the snow-filled street that he was trudging down. Warm light leaked out from cracks in the doors and shutters of the nearby homes, illuminating the surroundings as the sun set in the cloudy sky overhead. Most of the inhabitants of the city had long ago taken shelter inside from the cold night. They were now undoubtedly huddled close to the tame flames of their household fireplaces. The man grumbled as he pictured it. He hoped he would soon be sitting down beside a cozy fire as well. After shuffling through the snow and wind for several minutes the relieved young man found himself standing outside his destination, a tall well-maintained two-story home. It was located in the merchant's quarter, and while it wasn't quite a mansion the owner was obviously well-to-do. Wasting no time, he walked off the street and over to the doorway to announce himself. He meant to knock politely, but instead his fist pounded against the door loudly. He really wanted out of the miserable cold, his fingers had started to burn at the tips. Nothing happened for a few seconds. The man shivered and rubbed his hands together for warmth. Then the door opened and bathed the man in the path behind him in bright light. The visitor peered through the blinding glow to see that a tall well-dressed man had opened the door for him. Jaruk, by the gods man! Come on in and out of the weather. You must be absolutely freezing, the master of the house exclaimed. After quickly knocking some of the snow off of his cloak Jaruk stepped eagerly inside. The reception room of the house was lit by a steady oil lamp on a small table and decorated by various portraits and paintings. After a quick glance at his guest and after taking in Juruk's sorry state, the wealthy man frowned and turned to look down the hallway. Ennis, please get one of the servants to put some hot tea on for Juruk. The young fool walked here and is half frozen to death, he yelled before turning back to his guest. Thank you, Uncle Raoul. It's brutal out there. I almost thought I wasn't going to make it, the young man replied gratefully. His uncle gave him a questioning look and shook his head in exasperation. I honestly thought you'd be staying home tonight. I didn't expect you to have to brave the elements when I invited you over. We could have always done this another time, Raoul told his nephew. Juruk looked a little embarrassed as he hung his coat and cloak on the stand by the door. Oh well, it wasn't that bad out. Every real Coriolan can take a little ice and snow. Otherwise they would have moved south or back across the ocean to the homelands, Juruk joked. Be that as it may, it was still a somewhat foolish thing to do, his uncle replied. Well, you're here now so let's get you somewhere warmer while we talk. The library fireplace is lit. Follow me. As Raoul led his guest down the hallway towards the library, Juruk started feeling warmer. They arrived in the library and Raoul pointed him towards a large cushioned chair. Juruk sat down and his uncle took the seat opposite of him. There was a small ornate table between them, and the fireplace blazed cheerfully to his left. The wood within crackled as the flames consumed it, and a faint smell of smoke filled the air. As Juruk was making himself comfortable and enjoying the heat, a young maid walked into the room with a porcelain teapot and 2 cups on a silver tray. She smoothly placed the tray on the table and poured him and his uncle a cup of tea before curtsying and walking away. Both Raoul and Juruk took a sip. Juruk shivered one last time as the heat from the warm liquid and the fire drove the last of the chill from his bones. So, your father tells me you want to join the guard. Why the sudden decision? Raoul asked his nephew politely. Juruk frowned in response. He didn't think it was a sudden decision at all. Well, you know what's going on in the world right now better than I do, uncle, Juruk stated as his uncle nodded. Teshura and Holgaron have been at war for a while now, and while they are pretty far to the south it seems more than likely that Eloria and Devshur will start fighting soon as well. If that happens we won't be able to stay out of the fighting. It seems like we're going to need soldiers very soon. His uncle raised an eyebrow and displayed a questioning expression. So you want to join the Elorian army? Raoul asked tentatively, but Juruk shook his head vehemently in response. No, uncle, I'm not a fool. I've heard you, father, and others talking. The king of Eloria may think he owns Coriolis but no one here wants to die for him. Half the city is from Devshur, Juruk explained. His uncle sighed before responding. He seemed reluctant to speak but he spoke up anyway. I see you've put quite a bit of thought into this. So what do you think is going to happen then? The older man asked. Coriolis is the greatest city of the north. It's barely garrisoned, pays pretty much no taxes, and is run by the city council. I know you and father think that the city will break away before getting caught up in a southern war, and I think you're right. If it does separate then it will pull the rest of the north with it into a new country. I think that country will need an army and someone in the Coriolan Guard would be well placed to rise when that army is formed, Juruk continued passionately. His uncle looked thoughtful as he considered his nephew's words. You're not completely wrong, his uncle replied after several drawn-out seconds. Very well, I will help you get into the guard. I think that yours is not a bad plan. Juruk's eyes opened in surprise. He had not expected his uncle to support him. His father had been set against it. Thank you, uncle. By the gods I swear I will return the favor someday. Juruk exclaimed excitedly as his uncle chuckled. No need to be so melodramatic, Juruk. I know your father disapproves of how much time you spend outside, instead of working with him. The gods know it's dangerous outside the walls, but you should do what you want with your life. That's how I became a merchant after all, Raoul told Juruk. After that both of them made small talk and discussed the latest events. Soon however the tea had grown cold, the fire had burnt down, and they both grew tired. Juruk yawned as fatigue caught up with him. Well, I really should be getting back. Thank you for having me over, and again thank you so much for your support, Juruk said. His uncle looked surprised at the younger man's words. His teacup clanked lightly against his plate as he set it down. Nonsense, nephew, I won't have you going back out in such terrible weather at this time of night. You will stay over tonight and head back tomorrow morning. I will have the servants prepare a room for you, Raoul insisted. Juruk thought about it. He didn't want his father to worry about him, but at this time of night he was undoubtedly already in bed. As long as headed home at dawn before his father awoke it shouldn't be a problem. Very well. Thank you again, uncle, Juruk answered. Both the men then got up and shook hands as they said good night. Raoul called for a servant to take Juruk to his chamber and the young man went to bed. His earlier walk must have tired him out more than he knew because he was asleep almost before he hit the sheets. Juruk was awoken by the clanging of bells early the next morning. That wasn't right. What time was it? Groggily he got to his feet and opened the window's shutters. Outside, the dawn sun was still rising over the snow-covered city and had yet to banish the last of the night's darkness. Why were the city bells ringing so early? It made no sense. With a yawn, Juruk quickly got dressed and walked out into the halls. He didn't see anyone around so he marched to the kitchen. There several servants were chatting excitedly amongst themselves. Most looked either very tired or very worried. What's going on? He asked loudly and authoritatively as he entered the room. He hoped someone here could explain things. A sense of unease had been slowly building within him ever since he had woken up and he didn't know why. All the servants turned to him as he spoke. They cast each other nervous glances before one answered. We don't know, sir. All we know is the city bells are ringing and Mariel says it's the call to arms. Although, the rest of us aren't so sure, one older woman answered hesitantly. Jurek thought she was his uncle's cook. Was it an attack? That made no sense. Who would or even could attack them in the dead of winter? Even traders stopped arriving for the most part when the roads filled with snow. Are my uncle and aunt awake? Jurek asked as he frowned. We were just deciding whether to wake them, sir, the woman answered nervously. Do so, and tell them I'm heading out to find out what's going on and should be back soon with some answers, Jurek commanded them. The young man then turned around and swiftly made for the entrance. His hurried footsteps caused the wooden floor to creak beneath him. Wrapping his coat tightly around himself, he stepped out the front door and back into the frigid white city streets. With a sigh he then started stomping through the snow drifts towards the road. His breath was white and visible in the cold air, but at least the morning sun warmed him a little and the wind had died down. The streets were mostly deserted, as was normal for this early in the morning. However, a small group of people were huddled together in a nearby sheltered doorway. They looked apprehensive and uneasy to Jurek. He was just about to head over to them, when he heard the clutter of horseshoes on stone. Looking over he saw riders wearing guard uniforms coming down the street. The guardsmen didn't seem to be slowing as they approached, so Jurek called out to them. Why are the bells ringing? What's going on? He yelled as loudly as he could. The riders blew past him as they raced toward their destination, but one turned towards Jurek and quickly replied. There's a drake loose in the city. It was last seen around Low Point. Please return to your homes, citizens, the guardsman yelled back before he and his fellow riders disappeared down the road. They left nothing but a long cloud of swirling snow behind them. A drake. That made no sense, everyone knew they went underground into the deeps for the winter. Wait, had the guard said Low Point? That was where his father's house was. The bells probably wouldn't have woken him, he had always been a sound sleeper. Jurek took off down the street towards his home. As he ran the snow crunched under his feet, and the quality of the buildings around him dropped. They became smaller and less ornate, with more wood and less stone or brick, as he approached workman's area of the city where his father lived. He passed several small groups of talking people as he ran. One group even called out to him, but he ignored them as he hurried home. He had no time for them, he had to make sure his father was safe. As he turned the corner towards Low Point, a sudden terrible roar blasted through the city and overwhelmed him. He stumbled in surprise and fright as the deep scream cascaded over him. Even his bones seemed to shake for a second. Jurek had heard the howl of a drake before and seen their tracks out in the forest, but he had never seen one face to face. Few people had and lived. With a shiver of dread he realized that this drake sounded very close and very large. He paused in his run. Did he really want to head towards the beast? He had no choice though, he had get his father to safety. He was startled by an unexpected bang. The sound of buildings being torn apart and collapsing rubble exploded over him. Screams of horror and pain quickly followed. With a start Jurek realized people were dying. The very idea shocked him, he had never been around much violence. Then an unexpected splash of color up against a nearby wall caught his eye. It was a shredded corpse. Its blue guardsman uniform and the crimson blood dripping from its ripped open stomach were the source of the vivid colors that had attracted his attention. Jurek froze and gagged. Desperately he tried not to vomit. Looking about he spotted another discarded human body and then another. His eyes went wide with fear and he choked painfully as he spewed vomit onto the snow at his feet uncontrollably. What was going on here? The terrible scene before him made no sense. He felt sick. Even a large drake shouldn't be this big of a problem for the guards, and it certainly shouldn't be crushing buildings. Jurek began to twitch and go pale as he panicked. He shouldn't be here. Suddenly, he heard more screams from alarmingly close by. His head jerked to the right to see a small group of people run past him. They were a man and a woman clutching a small child to her breast, a family. The terror on their faces was plain and struck Jurek hard, drawing out his own fear. They weren't even dressed for the weather. Something dreadful must have driven them from their home without giving them any time to plan whatsoever. He couldn't even imagine. Jurek was terrified now. He wanted to continue on, but he couldn't take another step forward no matter how hard he tried. He was frozen in fear, and it shamed him deeply. A sudden gust whipped past and blew snow into the air all around him. He felt goosebumps rise on his skin as the temperature plummeted. From somewhere out in the white haze that had risen around him an explosive cracking sound erupted. Blindly, Jurek blindly spun around in fright as his heart tried to leap out of his chest. Horror awaited him as the wind died down. For a second he didn't believe his eyes. Crouched on the still crumbling remains of a casually demolished house sat the drake. The size of its gray-scaled bulk defied belief. Surely it couldn't be real. It had to be a dream, a nightmare. The beast dwarfed some of the homes around it. It balanced upon the rubble with four stocky legs that ended in curled claws meant for catching and ripping open prey. Its long thin tail swished behind it, throwing thick white clouds of snow up into the air. Its head sat upon a thick neck and bore a blue feathered crest. A line of blue feathers also ran down its back and stuck out from the back of its knees and the end of its tail. However, it was the dreadful beast's lizard-like head that Jurek couldn't tear his gaze away from. The humongous drake calmly surveyed its surroundings with intelligent hungry yellow eyes. It seemed totally unconcerned that it was currently right in the middle of a human city. Long sharp teeth flashed and blood dripped from its maw as it chewed its latest meal, the family that had just run past. It must have burst through the building and snatched them up in one lightning quick snap of its jaws. They hadn't had a chance. Blood was splattered across the once pure snow where they had been just seconds ago, and stained bits of cloth fluttered away in the wind. If there had been anything left in Juruk's stomach he would have thrown up again. As it was he could only stand there and shudder uncontrollably with his eyes wide in horror. One yellow eye of the beast flickered and Juruk thought it focused on him for a second. The beast continued leisurely chewing but Juruk had no doubt whatsoever that it was aware of him. It simply wasn't in a hurry, or maybe he didn't look that appetizing. Time seemed to have gone still for Juruk, or maybe it was stuck in an endless twisted loop. There was only the fluttering snow and the gnashing of the drake's teeth, over and over again. Every bite and chomping sound brought Juruk one step closer to losing his mind. It wore on him, like a countdown to his own demise spoken in a language he didn't understand. He was going to die. Then the beast swallowed the last of its grisly meal and to Juruk's surprise looked away down another street. Was it playing with him? Surely it wouldn't just leave him there. A buzzing sound built up in his ears. He didn't register it at first but as soon as he realized it was there a hail of arrows tore down from the sky upon the drake. The beast hunched its shoulders and turned its face from the unexpected barrage. The projectiles bounced and shattered on its grey scaly head. It was uninjured but as it raised its head Juruk thought it looked infuriated. The beast roared again and the sound of its displeasure tore through the city blasting away all other lesser sounds. "Run you blasted idiot!" Juruk heard someone yell from behind him. It took a second for him to recognize the sound as language, and another to move his stiff body and look for the source. He turned to see a squad of guardsmen. The sergeant in front was mounted on a horse and bore a long hunting spear. He was motioning for Juruk to run. Juruk cast a terrified look back at the beast, he was too afraid to move while it was still there. The beast however seemed to be descending from its perch among the rubble, and was moving away from him towards the source of the arrows. Juruk bolted. He didn't even think about it, he just did it. His feet carried him. Without looking back he rushed towards the soldiers. "Please don't let it be following me. Please gods I beg you." As he reached the soldiers in their blue uniforms the sergeant spoke again. "Keep running, lad. Head for the fort," he told Juruk before motioning to his men and leading them after the beast. Doing as he was told, Juruk ran past them. He scampered desperately through the snow towards the end of the street. Surely he was safe now. The guards were here and they had mounts and spears for hunting drakes. The beasts were far from invincible, even unusually large ones. Juruk ran over to a barrel someone had placed up against a house and threw himself behind it. There he began to suck down air as he tried to catch his breath. When his lungs no longer felt like they were burning and the dark terror that had clouded his mind begun to die down he risked a look out from his hiding spot. Dozens of guardsmen had the drake surrounded. Several groups with swords and spears circled it, working in unison to keep it at bay. Every time it tried to go after one group then archers hidden among the buildings would distract it with a rain of arrows. The drake was hissing and growling as it twisted and turned madly in an attempt to catch its tormentors, but they hadn't hurt it yet. Its hide remained unbreached. Suddenly one man got too close and the drake lashed out viciously. Its teeth closed down on the unlucky man and with a jerk of its neck it sent his corpse sailing through the air and over a building in a rain of blood. The sergeant didn't waste the opportunity his man's death had created. He lowered his spear and spurred his horse into a charge at the beast's unprotected flank. Juruk felt his heart soar. He was seeing something out of a story. He wanted to join the guard more than ever now. He wanted to be like the sergeant, fearless and skilled. The mounted officer's horse launched itself forward and the clatter of horse hooves echoed through the streets. As he approached the drake it turned towards him. Juruk knew that was all right, its head was even more of target than its flank. A good strike there would bring it down instantly. Juruk watched with anticipation as the two combatants closed. Surely the guardsman would be victorious. Suddenly, out of the corner of his eye Juruk noticed something strange. An odd breeze had begun to blow around the drake. It circled it like a slow whirlwind. The guardsmen closest to the beast began to falter and retreat, some pulled back while others simply collapsed onto the ground and curled up in the snow. With what seemed like a vicious smile, the great grey drake then opened its mouth and roared towards the charging guardsmen. Its breath picked up the snow and blew it forward. What was it doing? Opening its mouth just made it an even better target. What was going on? Juruk felt his earlier dread creep back up his spine. Something was very wrong. As the wave of blown snow reached the mounted officer he seemed to stiffen and his horse slowed. Juruk almost thought he saw white frost build up on them. Then they both stopped moving completely, right before impacting the drake. Juruk gasped in uncomprehending horror as the brave soldier and his mount toppled over stiffly to lay unmoving at the beast's feet. With a hissing noise that sounded almost like a snicker the terrible monster flicked its tail out and smashed the guardsman. Frozen chunks of meat were thrown into the air as he shattered. The crimson broken pieces of the man then fell to the ground and rolled through the snow. The drake turned towards the other guardsmen and blew another blast of freezing breath towards them. They struggled futilely and fell as Juruk looked on trembling in numb despair. This couldn't be happening. No wonder the beast was so large and active during the winter. It was a mutant. That wasn't fair. What were the chances of such a huge beast surviving being twisted by such powerful magic? How could the gods allow such a cruel joke? As Juruk watched the mutant drake scatter the remains of the guardsmen he had a dreadful premonition. The entire city would be brought to its knees by this unholy beast. It would feed freely on men, women, and children. The guardsmen, nobles, and probably even the mages would be helpless before it and its killing magical cold. Some of his neighbors would die as they cowered in their homes until they starved, froze, or were eaten. Others would try and evacuate only to collapse along the road one by one as they struggled futilely to make the dangerous journey through the snow-filled roads to safety. Coriolis was doomed. Soon it would be a place of bloody terror, and soon after that it would be a frozen graveyard. Jurek began to weep in despair as he stumbled blindly away through the snow.